I got loyalty, got royalty inside my DNA. I got love, peace, got war and peace inside my DNA. I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA.
Hello and welcome back to my channel, The Fanfic Fantasy. Join us as we explore the world of fanfiction and fantasy and bring you the best story and discussions. This is the first part of What If Tanjiro Became a Demon Instead of Nezuko. So give this video a like and subscribe for more videos in future. So let's get into the fanfic. Whenever happiness is destroyed, there is always Onii-chan. His finger twitched, ears reaching out to hear that single, teary-eyed voice. A familiar voice, one he had heard nearly his entire life, and yet for the life of him, he could not remember whose it was. His entire body ached, his nose twitching to the sickly sweet smell that made his stomach roll itself over in knots. Hunger making it feel like his insides were eating itself 10 times over. Something was wrong. Something was really, really wrong. Onii-chan, please wake up. The sound of struggle. Someone was trying to move his body, drag him from where he was laying face down on the snow, but whoever it was did not have enough strength to even pick him up, and the sobbing was only getting louder every second. He wanted to reach out and comfort it. He wanted to touch her cheek and tell her that everything will be all right. But even at his confused, mind-addled state, something was telling him that nothing was ever going to be all right again. They'd lost so much, he'd lost so much, all because he was too weak to protect them, to protect his entire world. Something inside him wanted to cry. Something inside him wanted to scream. Something inside him wanted to eat, the ravenous hunger seeking to overtake all of his emotions. The sickly sweet scent he had smelled earlier coming back to him with a vengeance, overriding his senses, and the next thing he knew he was opening his eyes, drool spilling down his parted lips, and above him, someone gasped. The smell of blood. A young girl with dark hair and pink eyes. His fingers twitched, long nails digging on the snow underneath him. Onii-chan, the young girl whispered. There were tear stains down her cheeks. He had never seen anyone look so despaired and yet so relieved. He wondered why. He wondered what happened to her. He wondered who she was. He wondered how it would feel to lunge at her frail form right then and there, how it would feel to bite and consume her flesh. Feel her warm blood soothe his parched throat. Something about that image felt so right and yet so wrong. His mind fighting against his own body. Eat. His body was yelling, begging. And he was so hungry, but he doesn't want to. Onii-chan, can you walk? I can't carry you, and the snow is so thick, I can't use the cart. If you can't, that's all right. I'll run down to the village and get a doctor. You can rest inside for a while. Don't die. Please hang in there, Onii-chan. I'll save you. I promise I'll save you. Onii-chan, he thought. Something you call your older brother. The familiar girl tried to help him up, ushering him from where he was laying down in the cold snow in front of the doorway, and inside the small home where the sickly sweet smell was stronger. The girl paled as soon as she opened the dilapidated door, but she steeled herself and guided him inside, and it was then that he saw it. The carnage that was inside of what used to be a quaint little home. Corpses of people strewn about carelessly, their blood seeping through the tatami floor. Mom, Takeo, Hanako, Shidru, Rokuta, seemingly against his will. His knees crumpled down onto the floor, tears filling his eyes as his throat let out the most agonizing sound. And it all came rushing back. His name was Kamado Tanjirou. Tanjirou, will you come inside and close the door? The cold is getting in. His mother, Kai, called out to him as she finished laying out their futon in preparation for the night. His younger siblings were already there, all changed into their sleepwear. Shidru and Hanako were teasing Takeo about something or other. Rokuta was clinging on their mother's yukata as he usually does. But Tanjirou's mind was somewhere else, worrying over where Nezuko was at the moment, especially now that it was getting dark. Do you think Nezuko got lost on her way up the mountain? I'm getting worried. Maybe I should go down and find her, Tanjirou replied as he followed his mother's orders, closing the door behind him as he walked back inside. Nezuko is a sensible girl. I'm sure she's already found somewhere to stay for the night and will be here come morning, Kai replied as she picked Rokuta up, shushing the other children in order to put their baby brother to sleep. At the very least, I'm sure old man Saburo will not let her climb the mountain in the dark, so rest assured that she will be safe. Tanjirou hesitated. But, no buts, Kai scolded. You will stay here for tonight and not wander, all right. Especially with your injured ankle. You are not going anywhere, young man. Tanjirou smiled sheepishly. It was bad luck, really. That is, he was transferring the charcoal into his basket in preparation for his trip down the village. He stumbled and sprained his ankle against a big rock that was buried under the snow. He had tried to hide his injury from everyone, intending to continue on with his trip to sell charcoal so his siblings would be able to have a feast when the new year arrives. But when Nezuko noticed and asked him seriously if he was feeling alright, she caught him out on his lie. Tanjiro had always been such a bad liar. He couldn't lie to save his life. Nezuko had sighed and handed him Rokuta right then and there, proposing that they switch chores for the day. Tanjiro would take care of their baby brother and Nezuko would go down the mountain to sell their wares. At first Tanjiro was worried as he didn't want her to get tired, but she insisted that charcoal was relatively lightweight. And sure enough, she didn't seem to have any major difficulty with getting the basket full of coal onto her back. He still didn't want her to go, insisting that as the eldest son it was his job to take care of things like this. But his younger sister only laughed and said, "But I am the eldest daughter of the Kamado family. It's my job to support you whenever I can. Who could we rely on if not each other?" He couldn't argue with that. In the end, he bid his sister goodbye as he watched her go down the mountain path on her own. The kids were delighted to find out that they had the whole day to spend with their beloved older brother and milked it for all it's worth. He was not able to help Takeo chop up some firewood because of his injury, but it seemed he was already satisfied with him just being there to talk to. He read some stories to Hanako, promised that he'll get goodies next time he goes to the village to Shidru, and the next thing he knew the sun was setting on the horizon, pulling the world into darkness, and Nezuko still wasn't home. He knew his mother was right. Nezuko must be staying over at someone else's house for the night. Their village loved Nezuko, and would not let anything bad happen to her. He was sure she was safe out there, that she will be alright. So why does the darkness tonight fill him with so much dread? Knock knock, little bunny from the little mountain. Why are your ears so long? Kai sang, ushering the little ones down onto the futon. Takeo mumbled about not needing any lullaby anymore, but he still snuggled against the covers and closed his eyes. Shidru and Hanako were giggling softly, and Tanjiro found himself smiling as he sat down beside Kai and reached over to run his fingers through their hair. When I was small, my mother ate the leaves of a tall tree, and that is why my ears are so long. Tanjiro closed his eyes to the soothing voice of his mother, humming along to the tune that Kai had used to sing even when he and Nezuko were little. Knock knock, little bunny from the little mountain. Why are your eyes so red? Tanjiro breathed in the scent of happiness and contentment coming off from his siblings and the scent of love from his mother. Even with the feeling of dread lingering in his heart, moments like these comfort him so much. When I was small, my mother ate the fruit of a red tree, and that is why my eyes are so red. The flame of their lamp flickered. Something stank. Something from outside. Tanjiro wrinkled his nose. He couldn't place it, couldn't figure out what it smelled like, just that it was bad. It smelled like, something like, knock knock, little bunny from the little mountain, danger. His eyes shot open, his hand immediately reaching over to grab the hatchet from the corner, standing up as he called out, "Watch out." The door exploded inside, as if it was kicked with a great force from the outside. Hanako screamed. Bits and pieces of the wood debris flew towards them from the explosion, and Tanjiro wasted no time to get between the threat and his family, even with the pain that was coming from his injured ankle. Fear gripped his heart as he aimed the hatchet at the person standing in front of their doorway. It was a man wearing a western suit, staring at the family impassively with his piercing red eyes, almost glowing in the lamplight. He didn't look very thrilled to be here. In fact, he almost looked bored, at least until his eyes settled on Tanjiro, those red eyes widening a little as he seemed to see something he really disliked. Tanjiro felt his heart pounding in his chest. The man smelled like nothing he had ever smelled before. He smelled like pure malice, pure evil, and at that moment Tanjiro was terrified of what he was going to do, terrified that he would not be able to protect his family. Those Hanafuda earrings. Interesting, the man said, almost to himself. You look so very much like him, it is unsightly. Who are you? What are you doing here? Tanjiro demanded. The man did not deign to reply. Tanjiro's grip on the hatchet tightened. He wasn't one to attack without provocation, but his nose does not lie. If the man even took one step towards his family, he would not hesitate to fling the hatchet at him with all his might. It only took a second. The man was absurdly fast. One moment he was standing there at the doorway and then the next he was right in front of Tanjiro, his entire arm punching right through Tanjiro's chest. Tanjiro could not even gasp. He was not sure if his lungs were even functioning anymore, certain that it must have been damaged by the now gaping hole in the middle of his chest. Hanako screamed again as he fell to the ground, coughing up blood, eyes focusing on his mother as he croaked out, "Mom, run." The horror in Kai's eyes was palpable, but her determination to get her remaining family away from danger won out. Quickly she was holding up Rokita, who was crying against her chest, yelling at the others to come quick and follow her, but the man was faster. In a single moment he was already in front of her, backhanding her across the face and up towards the ceiling. Rokita fell on the floor and the man stomped on his little head and crushed him, just like that. Someone was screaming. Tanjiro eventually realized that it was him. Shidru and Hanako looked terrified out of their wits, but Takeo was quick to take the hatchet that Tanjiro had dropped and yelled at the two younger kids, "You heard Nai-chan. Run!" With a yell, Takeo charged towards the man, who at this point could not possibly be human. With all his strength he cleaved the hatchet onto the man's back, but all it did was damage his clothes, and the force did not even seem enough to dig into his skin. Takeo gasped, and the next moment, the man had his hand around the young boy's throat, lifting him effortlessly as he crushed his windpipe. Tanjiro could not take his eyes away as the man tossed Takeo's body like it was a rag doll. Takeo hit the wall with a loud thud, his blood spraying all over the wall. Shidru and Hanako were against another wall, shivering in terror, and Tanjiro pleaded for them to run. Please, please, please run. But at this point even he didn't think it would matter. The man was simply too fast. With barely even an effort he killed his two remaining siblings as well. Hanako with a kick and Shidru with a hand through his heart. And Tanjiro screamed as much as he could scream with his weakening body, knowing that he too was going to die soon. Hearing his own heartbeat wane inside his ears, anger and terror brimming inside his dying heart. The man did not even seem perturbed, nor did he seem to break a sweat. He just looked at the carnage he had caused on the slaughtered family and turned on his feet, walking out of the house. Tanjiro wasn't about to let him get away. Ignoring all the pain he felt, he crawled over from the tatami floor and into the cold snow outside, grabbing the man's ankle, looking up at him with rage-filled eyes, yelling at the top of his lungs even as blood gurgled from his throat. "You, monster, you won't get away with this. I'll hunt you down and end you, even from beyond the grave." To his immense frustration, the man did not even look threatened. In fact, he looked mildly amused. Tanjiro supposed it was hard to feel threatened when the one doing the threatening was so clearly already on death's door. The man crouched down to meet him eye to eye, eyes flickering momentarily at the Hanafuda earrings he had mentioned earlier, murmuring once more to himself, a descendant of the Sun Breathers surely would have a chance to defeat the sun someday. He lifted a single finger, the nail on his fingertip turning blue and lengthening in front of Tanjiro's eyes. Tanjiro met the man's slitted red eyes and thought he saw a hunger there, filled with wanting and greed. "Why don't we try those words of yours, little sun breather? Would you still thirst for revenge when you've become the very being you despise? Would you even remember? I wonder." Tanjiro coughed out more blood, his fingers on the man's ankle weakening, his eyesight faltering and blurring out. "I'm getting ahead of myself. There is a chance you may not even survive the transformation." Perhaps it would not matter. He felt a stabbing pain against his forehead, a pinprick compared to the agony that was going on in his gaping chest. The tiny pain did not last though. Instead it started to burn, hotter and hotter, until Tanjiro was screaming himself hoarse, convulsing against the cold snow as his skin felt like it was being flayed over hot coals and torn apart over and over. It was beyond torture, beyond pain. He gasped until he can't gasp anymore, screamed until he could not scream anymore. Above him, he heard chuckling. The man was dusting off his clothes and watching. Tanjiro would not forgive him. Tanjiro would never forgive him. "I'll leave the corpses as a present for you. You'll have quite the feast. I'm quite generous, aren't I? Never, ever, never forgive." Tanjiro forced his eyes open, committing the man's visage to memory, inhaling to remember his scent. Something tells him he would not die tonight. Something was happening to his body. Something that was not necessarily a good thing. But one thing was for sure, he would never forget this man for as long as he lived, would never be satisfied until he had torn him apart with his bare hands. This rage was scary. Tanjiro had never been this angry his entire life. It felt suffocating, like he would lose his entire self in it, and Tanjiro was not sure what was waiting for him on the other side. Never. As he lost consciousness, a fleeting thought echoed in his head. A small bit of solace after a night of tragedy. At the very least, there was a single person he had not lost. A single person who was not here to see this nightmare unfold. Nezuko was safe. He had not lost his entire family. Nezuko was safe. And as he closed his eyes and let the darkness consume him, that was all that mattered. Tanjiro cried. As the eldest son of the Kamado family, he did not often allow himself the weakness of crying over something. Not since he was a small child. But the pain he was currently feeling was just so unbearable. It was tearing him up inside. He could not stop himself from collapsing onto the floor. His family was dead. Mom, Takeo, Hanako, Shidru, Rokuta. He branded all their names into his head, begging for forgiveness to their departed souls. "I'm sorry I could not protect you. I'm sorry I was weak." He clutched at his chest as he cried his heart out, his chest that no longer had a gaping hole in the middle, wondering how it was that he was alive. How was he alive when his whole family was dead? How were they dead while the monster that killed them remained at large? How was that fair? No, his entire family wasn't dead. There was still Nezuko. Nezuko. He looked up, seeing his little sister kneeling in front of him, holding him by the shoulders as if to offer her silent support. Nezuko looked teary-eyed as well, her eyes red and slightly swollen, evidence that she too had been sobbing not too long ago. Tanjiro reached over to embrace her, clutching at her back as he cried onto her neck, grateful for the smallest relief that Nezuko was alive. Nezuko was all right. Nezuko was right here, breathing, heart beating, smelling so delicious. Tanjiro caught where his thoughts were going, immediately scrambling back to get away from their shared embrace. What was that? Those thoughts did not come from his own head. It was like there was something inside him, something dark and primal, making him hyper-aware of the sickly sweet smell of blood around him and the way his stomach ached with hunger. Nezuko looked back at him, concerned and confused, but her eyes widened as she seemed to notice something about him, something off. "Oni-chan, are you?" Tanjiro opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out of his mouth but low growls. He wanted to tell Nezuko to stay right where she was, to not approach him because he didn't really feel like himself at the moment. He felt all kinds of wrong. He stared at his fingers, noting the long nails that protrude from his fingertips. He looked down at his chest, the yukata damaged and bloody where his injury once was, but all that was underneath it was smooth, undamaged skin. Even his ankle was no longer hurting, the sprain seemingly having healed overnight. He did not hurt anywhere, but he was hungry. He was so hungry. Nezu. He managed to choke out. Nezuko looked a little scared. Nevertheless, she steeled her gaze and reached out to him, touching his cheek. Tanjiro felt his hunger intensify at her closeness, at the smell of humans so close to his mouth. But even as his mouth filled up with saliva, even as the edge of his lips dribbled with drool, he realized he wasn't going to act on it. Because this was Nezuko, his sister, his only remaining family. He would never hurt Nezuko, no matter what his newfound instincts tell him to do. He would never hurt his family, not when he had failed them so utterly the night before. "Are you all right?" She hesitated, looking down at his fingers, at his mouth that he realized was now fanged, deep into his eyes. He wondered what he looked like, what she was seeing in him. It couldn't be anything good. She swallowed hard. It was not a bear, was it? Oni-chan would never do this. What happened? Was it man-eating demons? Like old man Saburo said. But then why are you? Tanjiro swallowed his drool and tried to speak to no avail. Resolve strengthened in Nezuko's eyes as she stood up. "I'm going to call the village doctor here after all. They must know how to help. Please wait a little longer, Oni-chan. There must be a way to fix whatever is wrong with you. We'll figure this out." And with that, she was hurrying out of the door. Tanjiro didn't know whether to encourage the idea or not. A part of him wasn't sure the doctor could do any kind of fixing in his current state. Something about it felt final, like there was something inside him that had been fundamentally changed. Nothing some simple medicine could fix. At the same time, he worried for Nezuko. After everything that happened, he was overcome with anxiety at the thought of letting his remaining family out of his sight. What if the monster who did this was still out there somehow? What if he finds Nezuko and kills her too? Tanjiro felt like something inside him would die. He let out a growl and decided to follow her. For a moment, he hesitated, as it was light outside, and some instinct told him he should not step out into the sun. The skies were cloudy though, the weather smelling of an upcoming snowstorm. He reached his hand out of the door, unsure what he even was wary about. But when nothing happened, he decided to continue on and follow his sister. Nezuko was already starting down the mountain trail, eager to get to the village, and Tanjiro was surprised how quickly he was able to follow her even with her head start. With all the strange new things happening inside his body, it seemed he was faster as well. He rushed to Nezuko's side and grabbed her arm. Nezuko gasped in surprise and turned her head to face him. Tanjiro opened his mouth and managed to croak, "Doctor," and then he shook his head vigorously. Nezuko seemed to get it. She looked worried. But it was then that Tanjiro smelled someone coming. It seemed his already sharp nose was sharpened even further. The person approaching smelled like sadness and rainwater, which was a strange combination to begin with. But there was also an underlying scent of ash that made Tanjiro's hackles rise. He heard him before he saw him, coming towards them with something that glinted against the meager sunlight. and Tanjiro was quick to push both himself and Nezuko out of the way, the stranger landing with a loud whoosh against the snow, scattering it to the air. Tanjiro situated himself in front of Nezuko and hissed at the stranger, his eyes slitting as veins appeared in his forehead and arms. The stranger stood in front of them emotionlessly, and Tanjiro realized that the thing he was holding that was glinting in the sun was a blue blade, the words "Destroy Demons" engraved at its surface, near its hilt. That did not bode well, especially now that Tanjiro was slowly realizing that maybe, just maybe, old man Saburo was onto something. Maybe that monster who killed Tanjirou's family was a literal monster after all, and whatever he did to Tanjiro. Would you still thirst for revenge when you've become the very being you despise? His fingers clenched, teeth bared, growling at the stranger in front of him. Nezuko was clinging to the back of his yukata, staring at the stranger as well with trepidation in her eyes. "Little girl, do you know what that thing you're clinging onto is?" the man asked, tightening his hold on his katana in a way that suggested he knew exactly how to use it. And Tanjiro wasn't sure what was going on. He found himself standing his ground in front of Nezuko, determined to protect his little sister from any kind of harm, be it from suspected demons that prowl in the dark or mysterious swordsmen that attack out of nowhere. If nothing else, he would not fail to protect Nezuko, not when she was the only family he had left. It seemed that the stranger was talking to Nezuko. Tanjiro felt her grip tighten against his yukata, and when she spoke she sounded a little affronted. "He's not a thing. He's my older brother." The stranger looked put off by her declaration. "Your older brother?" Tanjiro let out a low growl at the back of his throat. The stranger stared at him critically, before he let out a disbelieving grunt. "Ridiculous. That is not your brother any longer. Can't you see? It is merely being possessive of its prey. I recommend you step away from it right this instant, before you get hurt. My job is to slay demons. Needless to say, I would have to decapitate that demon." Tanjiro blinked. What? A slayer of demons was here to kill him? That kind of confirmed the fact that he had turned into something different, otherworldly, something not human. He remembered the strange instincts that plagued him since he woke up, the sense of hunger that ate at his insides even now. Did he really turn into a demon? How? Before he could react or process that statement, the stranger was suddenly in front of him, blade on an arc path dangerously close to his neck. Some instinct inside him screamed, "Not the neck, not the neck," and he decided to listen to it. He growled as he lifted his hand to protect himself, hissing in pain when the blade dug itself into his arm. Somewhere behind him, he heard Nezuko cry out, and it reminded him of Hanako from the night before. Red-hot anger built up in his chest, searing hot like the tears that gathered at the edge of his eyelids. The next thing he knew, he was swiping his clawed hand right at the face of this stranger who dared to rouse such memories within him, his hand reaching further than it should have. The man's blue eyes widened as he jumped back, somersaulting in the air before landing laterally at a nearby tree, using his momentum to kick himself off towards Tanjiro once again. "Oni-chan," Nezuko yelled as she stood in front of Tanjiro to shield him from the stranger's attack, using what looks to be a nearby tree branch to block the man's blade. The man pulled back once again, only to run to the side and attack Tanjiro directly from a different angle. And Tanjiro used his good hand to pull Nezuko closer back behind him and the other to attack. Blow by blow they parried, and the more they did the more Tanjiro realized that something was different. His arms felt longer, stronger, his line of sight was higher, and it was almost as if he was as tall as the stranger, tall like an adult. He didn't have time to really process it though. Nezuko circled around and used her branch to try and hit the demon slayer's back. It did not connect, but it still made the man jump back and give them a wide berth. Nezuko looked positively enraged. Even with only the branch as her weapon, she looked murderous. "Oni-chan hasn't killed anyone. We don't know why he's turned into something different, but Oni-chan hasn't done anything wrong," Nezuko yelled. "It's quite simple. Because his wounds were exposed to demon blood, he turned into a demon. That's how man-eating demons multiply," the man replied. "Oni-chan would never eat humans," Nezuko insisted. "Even as a demon, he remembers who I am. He remembers our family. He cried for our family. You can't even try to convince me that he's no longer himself when you know nothing." Cried. Jiu hesitated at the girl's passionate declaration, hand tight against his Nichiren blade, blue eyes darting between the human girl and her demon brother. Experience told him to disregard the girl's words no doubt born from hopeful naivete, from a desire to reject reality. A part of him was even considering the possibility that the demon probably had duped the girl into thinking this way, fooled his prey somehow, be it from some kind of mental blood demon arts or cold-blooded manipulation. There was just no way a demon would actually despair for the loss of human life, no matter if it was their family. To demons, humans were just food, a source of sustenance. When a demon is starving, it will kill and devour even its parents and siblings. Jiu had seen it happen more times than he could count. And yet, the demon boy was hissing at the pain in his arm, anger and panic evident in his slitted gaze. He was wounded, and no doubt severely starved at that moment, especially with his body expending energy on healing his injury. And yet even then he was not showing any signs of reaching out to his sister to try and devour her, nor did he seem to even consider it an option. Jiu wasn't certain what angle this demon was playing at, but just the fact that he thought that way alone was evidence that he was seeing reason and intelligence in this demon's mannerisms, a far cry from the bestial way most newly transformed demons present themselves. This demon was something different. It was something else. He couldn't help but wonder. The demon growled at the demon slayer once again, stepping forward to hover protectively in front of his sister. Jiu wondered if he was wrong for attacking without any warning, for not giving these siblings a chance. In the beginning he was highly skeptical, eager to discount the demon's protective stance as a mere possessiveness over its food. But now, the human girl let out a war cry as she once again charged towards him with her branch. But even as Jiu evaded, he had his eyes set on the demon's expression. There was a shifting in his crimson eyes that spoke of worry. A demon worrying over a human girl. Unbelievable. Jiu stepped back and then used the hilt of his sword to hit the girl's back, knocking her out cold into the snow, and he saw that worry turn into anger as the demon lunged at him with a loud growl. Jiu dodged all the demon's attacks, parried his claws with the blunt side of his sword effortlessly. Looking at the demon boy closer now, he could tell that the anger in his eyes spoke of a brother's love, a very human desire to protect his remaining family. There was also something else about the demon's eyes that made Jiu wonder. Up close and personal, this demon's eyes. Underneath all the pain and anger, they were gentle. Right then and there, Jiu decided he would give these siblings a chance. As the demon brother leaped off a tree to gain momentum and attack him, Jiu sheathed his Nichiren blade back into its scabbard, and deployed a chop at the back of the demon's neck. The demon let out a grunt as he fell into the snow, his body morphing back to its original size, silent and still. Was he making the right choice? Only time will tell. Deep in the darkness of his mind, the departed souls gathered. His mother's voice, leaning close to whisper, "I'm sorry to leave you behind, Tanjiro. Take care of Nezuko for me, all right?" Tanjiro gasped as he opened his eyes, hand reaching out to grab the heroism that his sister was wearing. His sister that was laying down on the snow right beside him. Confused, he tried to remember what happened before he passed out. The hunger, his family's corpses, the demon slayer, Nezuko losing consciousness, the sharp chop onto the back of his neck. He sat up, looking around as he pulled his sister's unconscious body closer to himself, reassured by the sound of her heart beating close to his. "I didn't expect you to wake up first." Tanjiro turned his head to the sound of the demon slayer's voice, standing a few meters away from them. He didn't seem to be in an attacking mood anymore at the moment, but the demon was still wary of him being around at all, not liking the fact that he attacked Nezuko. The man gave Tanjiro the same emotionless expression he had when he first arrived, though it seemed to be laced with something else this time. A sense of disbelief, of wonder. "You really are different," the man decided. Tanjiro growled lowly in response. "I could let you go and turn a blind eye to your situation. But as long as you are a demon, demon slayers will remain after you and your sister," Jiu confessed, being realistic. Knowing that, what do you want to do now? His vocal cords still felt foreign to him, and it was hard to put his thoughts into words. And yet, the response to that question was fairly simple, so simple that Tanjiro did not even have to think about it. "Protect Nezuko," he whispered, and then he remembered the monster that walked into their house last night, the demon he could not forgive. His eyes turned into slits, his long fingernails digging into his palm, drawing blood. Without realizing it, the second objective had passed through his lips. "Kill, demon." Jiu stared at him with something like pity in his eyes. "That second one would not be very easy," he replied. "The only demon who can turn other people into demons as well as Kibutsuji Musen, at least as far as the demon slayer core knows. He is the progenitor of all demons, very old and powerful, likely more than you could ever imagine." Tanjiro shook his head. He remembered his mother being backhanded into the roof, of Rokuta's head being crushed underfoot, Takeo and his selfless attack, Hanako and Shidru and their screams of pain and fear. Never forgive. Doesn't matter. There's something more important we have to do. Tanjiro was surprised when he heard Nezuko's voice, not even noticing that she had woken up in his anger. She sat up, rubbing her hand against her temple like she was staving off a headache, staring up at Jiu with a determined expression. "How can I turn Onii-chan back into a human?" Tanjiro had not even considered that. Once again, the hunger inside his stomach panged, reminding him that he needed to eat. But it seemed that the more he ignored it, the more it became merely a detail in the background. He was getting used to the hunger little by little. Once you become a demon, you can never go back to being a human. Jiu trailed off, before sighing, is what I would like to tell you. But the truth is, just because it has never been done before does not mean it's impossible. Nezuko leaned in, obviously interested. The demons might know how to heal your brother, but do not expect them to honor your will or wishes. If you want to get the information out of them, you must be prepared to fight. Fight? Nezuko whispered. Tanjiro tensed up, not liking where this was going. He was not about to allow his little sister to step up into the battlefield for his sake. It doesn't matter if he was a demon anyways. He could handle it just fine. It's fine, he tried to tell Nezuko. Doesn't matter. Nezuko looked indignant for his sake. Of course it matters, Onii-chan. We're going to find a way to bring you back to being human, she told him, holding both of his cheeks tenderly in her hands. Then everything will be alright. We won't have to worry about demon slayers after you. You won't have to worry about eating humans, either. We're both in this together, alright. Tanjiro felt the warmth of his sister's hands against his face, the gentle kindness in her eyes and the reassurance in her voice, and he couldn't help but feel tears start to burn at the back of his eyelids once again. Go see an old man named Yurikodaki Sakonji who lives at the foot of Mount Sajiri, the demon slayer told Nezuko. Tell him that Tomioka Jiu sent you. Tanjiro wanted to argue again, but Nezuko was already nodding, determined to walk this new path. As mild-mannered Nezuko usually was, he knew she too can sometimes be unbearably stubborn. Jiu turned his head to address Tanjiro. You seem to be alright since it's cloudy right now, but don't let yourself be exposed to sunlight, alright. Tanjiro nodded, rubbing his arms subconsciously. The wound from when Jiu had cut him with his katana was now completely healed. One last thing, Jiu continued, walking closer to the siblings. He was holding something with his right hand, something cylindrical and green. Nezuko saw it before Tanjiro did, looking indignant and proclaiming loudly, Onii-chan doesn't need that. Even so, Jiu replied, reaching over to place the bamboo muzzle on Tanjiro's mouth, carefully tying it at the back of his head. Tanjiro blinked, clawed hands reaching up to touch it, looking up at Jiu questioningly. Jiu nodded at him and continued. That muzzle is not a punishment, but rather a promise. A reassurance to everyone who will be around you that you mean no harm. A promise. Tanjiro's fangs bit into the bamboo idly, thinking that what Jiu said made sense. Even though Nezuko looked put off by it, Tanjiro actually did not mind. There was a certain feeling of safety at the assurance that should he ever lose control of himself, there will be a physical object keeping him from attacking humans. Of course he would never hurt Nezuko, he'd rather die. But what of other people? He would like to say that he'd never attack humans, but the hunger still swirling in his gut made him worry a little bit. Having the muzzle on him was fine. It was no big deal. He looked up at Jiu and nodded back. Jiu looked satisfied. Without a word, the demon slayer left, leaving the two siblings alone in the snow. For a moment, they both sat there, digesting the information they have just been given. And then they stared at each other, both pairs of eyes burning with resolve. They stood up, Nezuko reaching out to hold Tanjiro's hand, walking back home, faces filled with sadness and determination. We should bury them, shouldn't we? Will you be alright handling their bodies? Nezuko asked. Tanjiro nodded. Together they set to work, carrying bodies, digging through the frozen ground. It was tough work. But soon enough they have 5 graves in front of them, the 2 of them kneeling down to grant their departed souls their prayers. Tanjiro remembered the dream he had earlier, of his mother telling him to take care of Nezuko, and in his mind he promised that he will do his best. Their last moments with their family were melancholic. Tanjiro did not want to leave, but he and Nezuko were on a new path of their lives now. A path that would surely be filled with danger and strife, but a path they had to tread together. They packed lightly, only bringing some food and money and changing into clothes fit for travel. Just to be safe, they brought a hatchet with them as well. Tanjiro pulled his checkered haori over his clothes as Nezuko tied her long black hair into a neat bun. And just like that there was nothing else left to do, nothing else left to say, nothing but a goodbye to their old lives, as well as a promise that one day they will return. Together, they left the only home they have ever known, holding each other's hands as they hoped for a brighter tomorrow. The sunlight outside the cave was so unbearably hot. Tanjiro did not even want to think about walking under that fiery torture. Onii-chan, I'm back. Are you feeling any better? Nezuko called out as she peeked her head into the entrance of their current shelter. Tanjiro frowned at her from where he was sitting in the deepest, darkest corner of the cave, sharp fingernails scratching idly at the ground underneath him. He could nearly feel the heat of the sun even from in here, not literally, but he could imagine, and it was making him slightly queasy. He was tempted to dig a hole in the dirt and bury himself deep where the sun could never reach him, but he resisted. He may be a demon now, but he is not a mole. Nezuko looked slightly concerned as she walked inside, sitting down next to him, giving him a pat on the top of his head. I guess not. You really don't like the sun, huh, Oni-chan? Tanjiro shook his head vehemently, even though it made him a little sad. As a human, Tanjiro loved the sun, adored the way a sunny summer day always seemed to make the world just a little bit brighter, happier. As a demon, he could not even dare to stare at it for too long, nauseated at the mere idea of standing under its rays. It just reminded him of the fact that nothing was the same. It cemented the idea in Tanjiro's head that he was a different person now, even though he did not want any of this change. It made him uneasy. To be honest, I'd like to keep going even in the morning. We've still got a ways to go before we reach Mount Sajiri, but I guess it can't be helped, Nezuko murmured, staring outside for a moment. Tanjiro's mood dipped further. He didn't like that he was holding Nezuko back. His sister seemed to notice his reaction, using both of her hands to slap him on his cheeks. Hey, don't worry about it. It's alright. We could always set off at dusk, and I need to rest anyway. I've never traveled so far before. It's making me a little bit nervous, she confessed. Tanjiro lifted his arm to touch one of the hands that was cradling his cheeks, giving his little sister a soft smile. A smile that was hidden by his muzzle, but still evident in the crinkle of his eyes. It was a smile of encouragement, of gratitude. Personally, Tanjiro did not really like the idea that Nezuko would have to train and face demons all for his sake, but he understood that it was not something negotiable as far as Nezuko was concerned. The least Tanjiro could do was support her in any way he can, and do his best not to be a burden. The nervous look in Nezuko's eyes softened as she smiled back at Tanjiro. She sidled back close to his side, just like she always did back when they were younger, leaning so close that Tanjiro could smell her. The smell of humans still made Tanjiro's stomach growl, but it was counterbalanced by the smell of something that was entirely Kamado, the scent of fire and sunshine that Tanjiro had always associated with their family. This was Nezuko. This was his family. Letting out a contented sigh, he leaned back towards her frame, placing his head on her shoulder. He was a little taller than her, so it was a bit uncomfortable, but he didn't care. There was nothing that could stop him from appreciating this moment, this small bit of comfort and safety after the hell that they had gone through only a few days ago. Nezuko hummed a small tune softly, the same lullaby that their mother used to sing to them all the time. The same lullaby she was singing that fateful night. Even as sadness and melancholy tugged at Tanjiro's heart, he could feel his eyes drooping slowly. He suddenly felt really sleepy. Do demons even sleep? He did not know, but at that moment, he really wanted to close his eyes and fall into slumber. Maybe he could take a short nap. It's not like they were going to get anything done today after all, not while the sun was still shining bright. Oh, Nezuko exclaimed, as if she remembered something. Tanjiro blinked at her sleepily, rubbing his eyes and tilting his head at her questioningly. She smiled at him sheepishly. Oh, sorry Oni-chan, I didn't realize you were falling asleep. I was just thinking, wondered, really. She paused, taking a moment to choose her words. If Oni-chan was as small as, say, Rokuta. She trailed off, a small hint of sadness lingering in her eyes before she shook the painful memory off. I would be able to carry you everywhere. We could put you in a basket, cover it with layers of cloth, and we can continue on our journey, even during the day. Tanjiro blinked at her, not quite understanding. She gave him a patient smile. During the fight with Tomioka-san, Oni-chan transformed and became bigger like an adult. Do you think you could do it again, but this time smaller? She lifted her hand to show just how smaller, slowly pushing it close to the ground. Tanjiro stared at her hand for a long moment. Small, small. Nezuko wanted him to get smaller. He did not even remember being big. Now that he thought about it though, there was one point at his battle with Tomioka where he felt like his range was bigger, and that he was stronger. Was that when it happened? He stared at his hands, trying to remember. Back then, all he wanted was to be strong enough to protect Nezuko. Right now, what he wanted was to be useful somehow, to not hold Nezuko back. He focused on that feeling, determination simmering inside him, remembering his memories of being a small child. Memories that he was grateful to still have after his transformation. Small. He closed his eyes. After a long moment, he opened them again. Red eyes widened with childlike innocence as he looked up at Nezuko, who was now looking at him with barely contained amazement. His robe and haori pulled all around him, his limbs too short for the pants and sleeves. Was the world bigger? No, Tanjiro was just smaller. He did it. He let out a sound of glee as he lifted his hands merrily. Now Nezuko could carry him easily. It was very odd to be in a small body while Nezuko remained at her teenage self, but he supposed that's just one more thing to get used to. And it's not like he would stay at this age forever. Now that he knew how to consciously change shape, he was sure he could do it easily whenever necessary. PH. He vocalized his happiness through the muzzle. Look. Nezuko laughed softly, bringing her hand close to her mouth as her other hand reached out to pat his head once again. Good job, Onii-chan, she murmured, her gaze lingering for a moment on Tanjirou's face, and then on the muzzle, which Tanjiro presumed must now look absurdly big against his smaller face. The smile on her face faded into a small frown as she tugged at the bamboo a little, her expression speaking of disapproval. It's odd to see this on your face. Are you sure you're okay with it? Tanjiro nodded as his hands lifted to touch the muzzle, remembering Jiwoo's words. A promise that you mean no harm. Tanjiro knew that he was a demon now, that he was dangerous now, and any additional precaution was very much welcome. It was not like he was missing much anyways. Words were still difficult to Tanjiro, or at least speaking them were. He could think and understand them just fine, but talking was still beyond him. Maybe one day when he was feeling more confident in his self-control, he would remove this muzzle himself. For now, they're staying on. Nezuko still looked fairly displeased about his decision, but she did not press. Instead, she let out a small sigh as she stood up, proclaiming loudly, I'm gonna go find a basket we can put you in. There is a small village a small distance over. I'll be back as soon as I can. All right. Tanjiro did not really like Nezuko being out of his sight, especially going to all these unknown places, but it's not like he could do anything about it. Oh, what he would give to be able to hover protectively over her like a good older brother should. Right now, all he could do was trust that Nezuko could handle herself, and as he looked up at her frame, now towering over him from his low vantage point, he realized it. Nezuko had grown so big. It seemed as if it was only yesterday that she was a small bundle in their mother's arms. Nezuko will grow up to be a beautiful woman someday. One day she wouldn't need her Onii-chan anymore. The thought filled him with both sadness and pride. I'm off, Nezuko called out, waving goodbye at Tanjiro as she left the cave. Tanjiro waved back. It took Nezuko a little over 2 hours until she was back at the cave again, this time bringing a basket full of holes, some bamboo, and a fairly large blanket with her. Tanjiro shifted back to his usual size so he could help her by chopping up the bamboo stalks with their hatchet while Nezuko weaved it around the basket to reinforce it and get rid of the holes. But he soon realized that for some reason, being in this normal size made him feel sleepier. He was definitely more alert when he was in his younger body, strangely enough. He wondered why. With the two of them working together, the basket was fixed in no time. Tanjiro shifted back to his smaller self and found that he fit snugly inside. It was not the most comfortable of spaces, given that he had no room to stretch his legs, but it wasn't too bad, either. Nezuko looked pleased to be able to keep going, whispering a soft promise, I'll get you out of there when the sun sets, Onii-chan, as she wrapped the blanket around the basket in several layers, making sure that no sunlight will go through. It was surely a strange experience to be carried around like this. It reminded him of his younger days, back before even Nezuko was born, when he was carried around by his mom on her back while she did all the household chores. The memories were blurry, murky with age, but it was comforting all the same. As Nezuko hauled him on her back and started walking, Tanjiro occupied himself with anything he could find. Sometimes he would sit in silence and stare at his clawed fingers for hours, wiggling them about. Occasionally he would watch the faint shifting lights from inside the basket, and imagine what kind of scenery Nezuko was seeing outside. Sometimes, Nezuko would talk out loud about anything and everything, and he would respond with small grunts and taps on the basket. It was honestly a little boring to be alone with himself for hours, but he decided to be patient. Nezuko had been patient all her life, and Tanjiro could do the same. It was a few hours later when Nezuko finally set the basket down, unwrapping the whole thing and freeing Tanjiro from his weaved prison. It was already late, with the sun having set completely, the stars and the moon twinkling silently against the night sky. Tanjiro could hear Nezuko's breathing, harsh and labored, and he could see the drips of sweat that she wiped away with her sleeve. Tanjiro tried apologizing, but she did not want to hear it. She merely took the lead as they walked hand in hand through the forest trail, continuing on with their one-sided chatter, not even pausing for a bit of rest. At least until they reached the roadside temple. As soon as the smell wafted towards him, Tanjirou froze. This smell, it was the same sickly sweet scent that engulfed their former home that fateful night, the smell of blood. It was both appetizing and disgusting, confusing Tanjirou's body as to which was the proper response to the situation. His stomach rolled itself over in both revulsion and hunger, and he couldn't help but salivate a little, his eyes slitting as he clenched his fists. Blood, nearby, human, food, eat it. Oni-chan, what's wrong? It hurts. It was only then that he realized he had been squeezing Nezuko's hand a little too tightly, and he immediately let go. His mind was distracted from the primal thoughts for a moment, but then his eyes met with the worry in Nezuko's pink eyes, and it was all he needed to keep holding on to the remaining vestiges of his humanity, to squash down the starving demon deep within. He shook his head to get rid of the thoughts, giving Nezuko a beseeching look. His expression spoke of a deep, heartfelt apology for hurting her hand, as well as a sense of urgency as he tried to relay what he was smelling to his sister. He pointed a clawed finger at the temple in the distance, telling her where the trouble was coming from. Unfortunately, it was very hard to relay information with his muzzled mouth. Nezuko looked vaguely alarmed, but also very much confused. The temple, what about it? Tanjiro gestured at his nose, and then to his drooling mouth. Nezuko took a moment before she realized. There was only one other moment that she had seen him drooling after all, and that was the time he first saw their family's massacred bodies. A little bit of fear crept up her eyes, but it was quickly painted over with determination. She looked back at the temple, no hesitation in her expression. Do you think someone in there is injured? This mountain path is pretty rough. After all, someone might have gotten hurt. Oni-chan should stay here while I check on them. If the blood is too much for you, but we have to help somehow. Nezuko was about to race up the temple steps on her own when Tanjiro reached out a hand to stop her. Not because he did not want to help the possibly injured people. He did, but because beneath the dizzyingly sweet scent of blood there was also another one. Something that smelled sour and putrid, reminding him of the monster that killed their family, although the malice was to a lesser degree. At that moment, he was certain that there was another demon up there, and he wasn't about to let Nezuko face them alone. The words "I'm coming with you" could not possibly be as clear on his face as it was then, and together they ran up the steps, both knowing that danger possibly awaited them, but both as intent on helping out someone in need. Unfortunately, it appeared that they were already way too late. Nezuko gasped and let out a soft sob when she saw the corpses, the luridness of the scene reminiscent of the massacre of their family not very long ago. There were 3 middle-aged men, all lying motionless on the floor in a pool of their own blood, and in front of them sat a figure that Tanjiro was certain was the demon he had smelled earlier. The scent of the blood was almost too much on Tanjiro, reviving those instincts that he wanted to keep buried deep within. Seeing the demon munching on actual humans was even worse, his body screaming at him to grab a limb or two, to sink his teeth into human flesh. He clenched his fists, his sharp nails digging into his skin and drawing blood. Saliva built up and spilled out of his mouth, flowing down under his muzzle and onto the floor. What the hell? This is my turf, the demon growled, twisting his head to look back at them. If you break into my territory, I'll make you pay. A man-eating demon. The demon licked his bloody fingers as he studied them, tone curious. There's something off about you. Are you both humans? He started standing up. Tanjiro heard Nezuko's breath hitch. The single candlelight flickered and went out, bathing their surroundings in darkness. He's going to attack. Tanjiro's body moved before he could even process it. Protect Nezuko. The demon was going to lunge at Nezuko, hand outstretched as if to grab at her, but Tanjiro was faster. Eyes slitted, veins popping at his forehead. Tanjiro unleashed his full strength as he used his legs to kick the defending hand out of the way, followed by his own lunge as he grabbed the demon by the throat, hurling him down hard into the floor. The demon choked, letting out strangled gasps, but Tanjiro did not let up, merely squeezing harder to crush his neck completely. There was that rage again, the same one he felt for that monster, and now for this demon who dared to attack his only remaining family. It was terrifying. The same rage that seemed to swallow him whole, leaving him a husk of his old self, more demon than human, craving vengeance more than justice. Blood flowed from between his fingers, the demon beheaded with his efforts, but something in Tanjiro knew that it was not over. He did not let his guard down. Oni-chan. Nezuko was now clutching the hatchet on her hands. Good. She wasn't as experienced as Tanjiro or Takeo when it came to chopping wood. She did not quite have the same upper body strength. But something was better than nothing. He looked back at the demon underneath him. The body was slowly moving again, and Tanjiro did not give it a chance as he kicked it harshly to the side, hurtling it past Nezuko and to the temple grounds outside, where he knew he could have more space to fight. He then grabbed the head, which was now shouting, screeching, "You bastards. One of you is a demon after all. You gave off such a weird vibe. What's a human and a demon doing teaming up?" Tanjiro ignored him, about to throw the head outside as well, but to his chagrin, the head actually grew arms, the demon's hair lengthening and tangling around Tanjiro's fingers. Now with the demon head stuck on his hand and the arms trying to punch at him, Tanjiro let out a harsh growl, especially when he noticed the body from outside standing up, jumping towards them with all its might to attack Tanjiro again. Nezuko looked surprised at the turn of events but not unready. As Tanjiro parried with the body as best as he could, Nezuko let out a cry and charged at the headless body, using the hatchet to carve a deep wound at the body's back. The head let out a stream of curses when it connected, as though he felt the injury himself. Tanjiro did not waste any time and headbutted the head, the demon letting out more pain curses, before he then proceeded to let go of Tanjiro's hand in favor of hurtling himself teeth first onto Nezuko's hatchet. Nezuko let out a little shriek, shaking the hatchet in hopes of getting the demon off, but the demon held firm. Out of options, she swung the hatchet with force down onto the ground as if she was splitting wood, the hatchet blade digging between the demon's teeth and onto his cheeks and skull, causing him to gurgle blood. As the sound of cracking bones lingered in the air, Tanjiro thought he heard Nezuko murmur a soft apology. Fighting the body after the head had been incapacitated was mere child's play. It seemed to Tanjiro that the body and the head were connected after all. The body's blows were weaker, and it was easier to deflect its attacks. Still, Tanjiro was not quite sure how to really defeat the demon for good. He glanced at Nezuko, who seemed to be keeping an eye on the head and making sure it won't regenerate, repeating the downward motion of her hatchet whenever necessary. He glanced up at the sky, wondering how long he had to wait until sunrise, and if there's a way to incapacitate the demon's body until then. Would he need to crush all its limbs completely so that it could no longer move? But what if it just regenerates itself regardless? Could it regenerate its own head even though the original head was still attached to the hatchet? All these questions swarmed inside his head as he tried not to get beat up too badly, and so far he was succeeding. It was just that the fight was dragging on, unpleasantly so, and Tanjiro was already getting tired. Thankfully, they did not have to wait for the sun to rise. All it took was one quick swing of a sword. Tanjiro blinked as suddenly, the body he was fighting was cut diagonally, from the base of its neck on its right side to its left waist. It was a cut so clean that even Tanjiro's enhanced demon senses did not see it coming, nor did he hear the wielder of the blade's footsteps when he ran near. Tanjiro stared in wonder as the body dissolved into ash, wrinkling his nose at the smell, wondering why it seemed so familiar, even though he had never seen a demon die before. He realized then that it was the same smell of ash that lingered on Jiyu's scent when they first met him, the same one that was also an undercurrent to the scent of a calm, earthy lake that engulfed this newcomer, the scent of a demon slayer. Tanjiro tensed, immediately jumping back to his sister's side. He glanced at the head that was stuck to the hatchet and noted that it too was crumbling to ash. Now with the immediate threat gone, he was calming down. He protected Nezuko. Nezuko was safe. Tanjiro could breathe easy now that the fight was over and the uncontrollable rage was gone from his blood. He couldn't help but feel a little sorry that the demon had to suffer so much. There was a small dawning horror at the idea that he was the cause of that suffering, that Nezuko had to resort to such violent measures to keep the head from regenerating. It felt like something out of a horrible nightmare. But this was their world now. They could no longer go back. Nezuko looked a little shaken, her hatchet still covered with copious amounts of blood. Tanjiro remained alert, unsure who or even if they could trust this new demon slayer, or if he too was a threat. The man was wearing a blue cloud patterned kimono with a white cloth that covers his head and a red tengu mask, the blue blade of his katana glinting against the moonlight. The three of them studied each other at a standstill for a long moment, at least until the man moved and sheathed his sword, the glare of the dark eyes of his mask watching them intently. Nezuko was the first to speak. "Gee, good evening." The very normal way Nezuko chose to greet the man was almost comical compared to the circumstances they had found themselves in. A demon slayer, and a human girl walked into a temple. It seemed like the setup for a joke, but nothing about this whole situation was funny at all. The three of them had just taken a life of a demon, sure, but that demon was once human, too. Just like Tanjiro. It's not like they had a choice though. If the demon slayer had not dealt the final blow, that demon would continue killing and eating more people. The man replied with a clear voice, "I'm Yurikodaki Sakonji. I am assuming you two are the ones Tomioka Jiyu sent my way." Nezuko straightened up. Why yes, my name is Kamado Nezuko, and this is my brother Kamado Tanjirou. She bowed respectfully, trying to look presentable even with the bloody hatchet still on her hands. I am very pleased to meet you, Urokodaki-san. Will be in your care. Nezuko, what will you do when your brother devours a human? Nezuko's eyes widened as she looked up, evidently caught off guard by the question. She opened her mouth and closed it a few times, seemingly unsure how to respond. Urokodaki walked towards her and raised his hand as if to slap her cheek, and Tanjiro let out a growl, and was about to catch it, but to his surprise it was Nezuko herself who caught the hand mid-swing, looking up at the man with a new fire in her eyes. There is no when, because I will never let that happen. Silence. Nezuko then let go of Urokodaki's arm and took a step back, reaching out to snatch Tanjiro's hand, before bowing once again. My brother is the gentlest, kindest person in the world. I will never let his honor be tainted. That's why I'm on this path, Urokodaki-san. I want to become a demon slayer so I could heal him, and give him back the humanity that was stolen from him. I'm not going to rest until I do that. The hand holding Tanjiro's tightened, and Tanjiro felt something in his chest tighten as well at Nezuko's words. Oni-chan will never devour a human. I swear it on my life. Urokodaki studied Nezuko, placing his hands behind his back. It seemed that Nezuko passed some kind of trial. I will have to test you to see if you are fit to become a member of the Demon Slayer Corps. Of course, Nezuko replied as she lifted her head, determined. Urokodaki nodded sagely, and it was only then that he gave Tanjiro his attention. Tanjiro shifted anxiously, his hand still clutched in his sister's hold. When the man spoke, his voice was more gentle. We are going to have to bury the people who were killed inside the temple. I think it would be better if you stay out of the way. The bodies, Tanjiro had nearly forgotten about them. He remembered how he had almost lost control at the scent of their blood, tempted to do as Urokodaki said and not challenge his demonic instincts further. It was surely the prudent thing to do, but he felt like he owed it to them to at least see them off, after all. Had he and Nezuko arrived much earlier, they probably would not have ended up dead. He shook his head solemnly. I want to help. Urokodaki's scent gave a whiff of surprise, but the man did not show it. He simply nodded. Very well. Digging through the dirt and transferring the bodies took them some time. As soon as they finished burying them, Tanjiro and Nezuko knelt in front of the graves and prayed for their departed souls. Tanjiro could feel Urokodaki's gaze at the back of his head, his sense showing signs of silent disbelief, probably at the image of a demon praying for the passing of a human life. Tanjiro ignored it, finishing up his prayers and standing up, dusting the dirt off his knees. Nezuko did the same soon after. Ah, the sun's coming up again, Tanjiro thought, woefully looking up at the brightening sky. He was not looking forward to another day of being stashed inside the basket as they traveled. Did not enjoy being a literal heavy burden that Nezuko had to carry on her back. He was the older brother. He was the one who was supposed to do these things. He was the one who was supposed to make things easier for his younger siblings. This whole quest of Nezuko becoming a demon slayer was for his sake, and even with a few days to get used to it, it still left a bad taste in his mouth. Unfortunately, the sun will rise no matter how much Tanjiro wished it wouldn't. With little coaxing, he shifted back into his smaller form and jumped into the basket, shifting around to make himself comfortable. The cloth was once again wrapped around him, making the cramped space dim. From outside of his confines, he heard Nezuko tell Urokodaki that she's ready, and it was then that it started the most jarringly awful basket ride of his life. It was not even the fact that Nezuko's running made the basket bounce around her back erratically. Tanjiro could deal with a little discomfort here and there. It was the sound of her wheezing as she tried to catch her breath, the smell of her sweat as she struggled to keep up with the faster Urokodaki, determined not to lose him from her sight. It was the way her voice cracked whenever she paused to readjust the straps of the basket on her back, reassuring Tanjiro that she was alright, and that she was totally gaining distance on the old man. But she just needed just a little break before they continue, breaks that were not long enough in Tanjiro's opinion. Halfway through the trip he found his eyes getting heavy, which was strange considering all the bouncing around was not conducive to sleep at all. But he kept his eyes open, unwilling to take a nap, not while Nezuko was working so hard. If Nezuko was not getting any rest, neither was he. All he could offer right now was moral support and solidarity. And now, have I passed the test? He heard Nezuko ask a few hours later, gasping between her words. The orange tint of the inside of the basket assured Tanjiro that it was already sunset, and he was already very eager to get out and give his little sister a big hug for doing her best and hanging in there. He was glad that it was all over, or at least he would be if it really was. Unfortunately, Urokodaki has different things in mind. The test starts now. We're going to climb a mountain. At that moment, Tanjiro wanted to just burst out of the basket and give Urokodaki a punch in the gut, demon slayer cultivator or not. Can't he see that Nezuko was already tired, barely hanging on to her last legs? Who lets a girl run that fast and that far with barely any rest anyways? Only a heartless person would. Nezuko deserves to rest. Who was he to think he could treat Tanjiro's little sister this way? The complaints were already at the tip of his tongue, threatening to spill out, but then he heard Nezuko chuckle through her panting. And when she spoke, she did not sound put off at all. I see. Bring it on. Tanjiro paused. His sister, Nezuko, was becoming such a strong person. It made sense. It was not only Tanjiro who had lost his family. Nezuko had to go through all these bad things, too. Tanjiro wondered if it was even worse for her, to be the one who was not even given the chance to protect their younger siblings. Who was the one who had to go through the shock of seeing their bodies for the first time, without any preamble. Everything was right in the world until it wasn't, for Nezuko. Her family died. Her remaining brother is a demon. She needed to train and fight to turn him back. It was a heavy burden to bear for any 12-year-old's shoulders. It made sense that Nezuko was coping with the loss and the tragedy by becoming stronger, both in mind and in spirit. And Tanjiro wondered if one day the patient, serene Nezuko of their hometown would be all but gone, replaced by a hardened warrior. Like Tanjiro, Nezuko was changing too, and Tanjiro wasn't sure how to feel about it. He was let out of the basket only a few moments later. Free from the confined space and the incessant bouncing, Tanjiro was feeling drowsy again. But he still did not succumb to sleep. Nezuko looked even worse than she sounded. Her once neat bun was loose and tangled, her kimono was drenched in sweat, but she had retained the fire in her eyes and the softness in her smile when she patted Tanjiro's head, assuring him that she will be alright and she will be back soon after she passed the test Urokodaki had in mind. With a few grunts and intense nodding, Tanjiro was able to tell her how much he's rooting for her, how much he hopes for her safe return. Within a few minutes, Nezuko had tidied herself up and bidding him goodbye. Tanjiro figured his worry must be obvious, because before he left, Urokodaki gave the demon boy a look and muttered, "Don't worry, I'll make sure to take care of your sister for you." As the door moved to close, Tanjiro placed his hands on the floor and bowed in a doji, his head touching the floor. "I'm counting on you, sir." With Nezuko and Urokodaki both gone, Tanjiro had some time all to himself. For a long time, he simply sat in front of the door, waiting for their return. When it became apparent that they would not be back for some time, Tanjiro decided to stand up, wandering around Urokodaki's humble home. The house wasn't all that big. In fact, their family's house might actually be bigger, although not by much. It was evident that Urokodaki was used to living all by himself. The main house was just a big room with a wooden floor and a traditional elreee right near the entrance, although the hearth was cold and empty right now. Further back there was another room that Tanjiro supposed must be where Urokodaki sleeps. He decided not to snoop in there, if only to give the old man some privacy. There was a small kitchen in the main room, placed in the corner and out of the way, as well as a wooden cabinet that Tanjiro found himself a little curious about. Opening it up, there was nothing really remarkable inside. There were some futons, a couple of miscellaneous items, a few hand-carved fox masks, some books. Tanjiro wondered if Urokodaki would mind if he took and read some to stave off the boredom. But then, something in the corner caught his eye. It was just an innocuous hand mirror, small and obviously not very used, given that it was just haphazardly stuffed beside all the other items. Tanjiro stared at it for a long moment, wondering. His hand reached up to touch his hair, still fairly long and tied to the back of his head, down to the Hanafuda earrings that he had inherited from his father, further down to the bamboo muzzle placed in front of his mouth. He thought, and wondered, how different did he look like, now that he wasn't human? He took the hand mirror and stared. Upon first glance, there wasn't really much of a difference. Just regular Tanjiro with a muzzle in his mouth. His complexion did not look any different, there were no obvious mutations he could see, and the muzzle itself covered up his fangs completely. His eyes were probably slightly different, though. Were they darker? He had always shared eyes with his father, a burgundy, wine-red sort of color, but now they look more crimson. Like blood. Now in his relaxed state, his eyes looked just like any regular human, but he remembered Nezuko mentioning that it becomes slitted like a cat's occasionally. He remembered that the monster's eyes were also slitted that night. There was also something else, something different that was just plain weird. The scar on top of his head, the one he got from protecting his little brother from the brazier back when he was younger. It was gone, replaced with a dark red mark that looked something akin to flames, licking from the top of his forehead down to just above his eyebrow. He remembered that the temple demon had green marks around his upper arms and legs. Maybe it's a demon thing. He wondered if he could get Nezuko to ask Urokodaki about these sorts of things. But he supposed the demon slayer's duty was only to slay demons, not to know more about their appearance and biology. He set the hand mirror down, placing it back to where he took it, closing the cabinet after he did. As if on cue, the door of the house slid open, and Tanjiro immediately perked up, thinking that Nezuko had finally come back, but was then disappointed when it was only Urokodaki, entering the house by himself. Worry once again threatened to spill over Tanjiro's heart. It was pretty late already, and now that he knew that the darkness were where demons come out to play, he didn't like the idea of Nezuko still being alone outside at this time of the day. He stood his ground and gave Urokodaki a pretty intense glare. "You said you'll take care of her," he managed to accuse with the look in his eyes alone. Urokodaki did not seem fazed. "Nezuko is up the mountain, doing the test as we speak. There is no need to worry. I have made sure myself that there are no demons up there. At worst, she may return with some injuries, but nothing that can't be fixed with medicine and rest." Truth be told, Tanjiro did not like the idea of his sister returning with any injuries, either. But he understood that Urokodaki wasn't about to go easy on Nezuko, just because Tanjiro asked. He was there to train her, not coddle her. At the end of the day, you can't forge a sword without first putting it through tremendous heat. Nezuko is strong, he reminded himself. Nezuko will be alright. Urokodaki sat by the elreee, tending to it to start a fire. Tanjiro hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do now, but he eventually walked closer to help. Between the two of them, they managed to get a fire going with minimal issue. Urokodaki went to the corner kitchen and started chopping up some vegetables for what Tanjiro figured must be dinner. Well, Urokodaki and Nezuko's dinner anyways. Tanjiro had not a single bite of human food since he turned into a demon, and while he probably could stomach it still, there would be no point. Human food did not give any sustenance to demons. Only human flesh and blood do. Instead, Tanjiro contented himself with sitting in front of the elreee, soaking in the warmth that he had missed since he and Nezuko had left their hometown. The warmth was comforting, and it made him feel sleepy all over again. When he found his eyes slipping close though, he shook his head and slapped his cheeks a couple times. He was not going to sleep while Nezuko was working hard out there. He will wait for her to get back. Urokodaki started, catching Tanjiro's attention. For a demon, you have tremendous self-control. The old man seemed to hesitate, before continuing. When I left my home to go meet up with you and your sister, I have to admit I expected the demon brother to have very little to no sense of self at all, as is often the case with newly turned demons. They move by instinct, devouring the first human they see, and it is only after they have already committed terrible acts that their senses come back to them, albeit now twisted and malicious. But you seem to have retained much of your humanity and memories. You still care for your sister very much, and show signs that you comprehend what is happening. Tanjiro listened and nodded with intelligent eyes, understanding evident in his expression. I have to warn you that you and your sister would have to face more pain and misery moving forward, Urokodaki said with a cold tone. But Tanjiro could smell the kind intent underneath his words, a harsh warning. The path of a demon slayer is a path well worn, but it is not very uncommon for slayers to never get the chance to retire, to be killed in action. Some demon slayer candidates never live through the final selection at all. For that reason, I will be as strict as I could be when training Nezuko. She will swing the sword until the hilt pops the blisters in her palms. She will learn how to breathe until her lungs feel like exploding. She will run down the mountain traps I said until she is bloody and bruised from the top of her head to the bottom of her feet. Urokodaki paused, moving his head to face Tanjiro. She will train to death, and she seems to be very much willing to. Do you think you can handle that, Tanjiro? Tanjiro looked down at his hands, which were now shaking against his lap. This is what Nezuko wanted. This is what they came here for. His fangs bit into the muzzle, jaw clenched as he imagined what it would be like to see his little sister go through all that. It would be torture. He wished he could take the bruises himself, take away all the pain. But he couldn't. Nezuko had to do this on her own. He took a deep breath and nodded, head hung low. Urokodaki walked over to place a cast iron pot filled with water above the flames, slipping the ingredients he had chopped for it to stew. Tanjiro watched the flames silently. Neither of them spoke again for some time, merely waiting for Nezuko to come back, bodies facing the doors expectantly. Tanjiro almost fell asleep multiple times, but Nezuko had not gotten any proper sleep in days either, so he was not going to give in. He heard it before he saw it. Just before dawn broke, the sound of heavy panting, followed by the door of the house opening. Nezuko was standing and leaning against the doorframe. Her black hair was even more disheveled than it was earlier, half of it breaking free and flowing in rivulets down to her waist. Her favorite kimono now looked beat up and dirty, stained in blood in places, and she seemed to be suffering from a head wound, as her forehead was matted with blood. Still, even with all the mess, she was grinning, evidently proud of herself, saying between pants, "I made it. Urokodaki-san, I made it." Before sunrise, she swayed and Tanjirou was immediately beside her, supporting half of her body weight as he ushered her inside. She let out a pained moan, murmuring I did it, under her breath before she collapsed against Tanjirou. Tanjirou looked up at Urokodaki in panic. The old man only patted Tanjirou's head, before helping him haul Nezuko inside and lay her down onto a futon. "Don't worry, Tanjirou," he assured him. "She is fine. She is just tired, let her rest. You should, too. I've seen you trying to fight sleep more times than I can count." Tanjirou relaxed after that. Urokodaki set up a futon right next to Nezuko's, and for that he was grateful. He sidled close to Nezuko's side and finally let his eyelids drop, and within minutes he was slumbering, the fatigue finally catching up to him. Urokodaki watched the two siblings sleep, his mind wandering. "Forgive my abruptness, Urokodaki Sakanjai Dono. On sending a girl your way who wants to become a demon slayer swordsman, she was brazen enough to attack me, barely armed. Her family was slaughtered by a demon, and the surviving older brother has become one, but I have determined that he will not attack humans. I can sense something different about these two. She is strong-willed and determined. Perhaps she will find a way to break through and become your successor. I am asking you to train her. I realize that this is a self-serving request, but please forgive me. I hope that you will take good care of yourself in your endeavors. Yours truly, Tomioka Jiyu." When Urokodaki received the letter from the Kasugai Crow, he was surprised. Jiyu had not contacted him in years. After Sabito's death, his only living disciple was never quite the same. Urokodaki knew Jiyu felt immense guilt at the loss of his friend, internalizing it and pushing people off, even his old master. The fact that Jiyu was contacting him like this must mean it was something important, something Jiyu felt strongly about. As it turned out, Jiyu was asking for a favor, something he did not do often, and so Urokodaki decided to see what these siblings were all about, to make such a large impression on the current water pillar. He decided not to wait for them to get to Mount Sajiri and to meet them halfway, if only to make sure they won't get lost on their way to his home. Or worse. Truth be told, he was concerned about the human girl Jiyu was talking about, the demon slayer candidate, worried that Jiyu had misjudged after all and her demon brother was already feasting on her corpse somewhere out there. It was not that he didn't trust Jiyu's judgment. He was just being realistic. The idea of a demon that won't attack humans was like something out of someone's idealistic fantasies, nowhere close to actual reality. But Jiyu was not the type to let a demon go willy-nilly, and because of that, Urokodaki was willing to give the demon brother the benefit of the doubt. A decision that paid off, surprisingly so. The demon brother, Tanjirou, was something else. When Urokodaki first met them in front of the temple, right after he killed the demon that the siblings were fighting, he was at first confused. Tanjirou had quickly jumped back to his sister's side, glancing at the body of the crumbling demon, and at that moment, Urokodaki thought his nose caught the whiff of empathy, as if Tanjirou was feeling sorry for the demon who had died, even though the same demon had tried to kill them not too long ago. And it wasn't just Tanjirou either. Nezuko too had that scent of kindness about her, kindness that Urokodaki had immediately judged as a flaw, something that could be fatal to someone who wants to be a demon slayer. He had thought then, these kids are too kind. They're facing a demon, and yet the scent of kindness remains. He was tempted to write Nezuko off with that, convinced that she didn't have what it takes to be a demon slayer. And yet, her hands were dirty with blood, her hatchet stained crimson. She seemed shaken, but she didn't relent on the brutality that was required of her when she faced the demon's head, presumably to help out and protect her brother. There is potential there, he could give her that. When Nezuko declared her intent to not let her brother eat humans ever, the potential Urokodaki had seen in her seemed to increase tenfold. She had a strong resolve, he could see it in her eyes. She had a lot of growing to do, for sure. She was merely a young, frail girl with barely any muscle on her. But as long as she was determined, he could hone that delicate body into something powerful. He had done it before, with sweet Mekomo. He thought about what Jiyu had said in his letter, about how Nezuko could probably be the one who could break through the final selection block after years and years of no other water-breathing swordsman making it through. For her sake and her brother's, he hoped so too. At the moment though, Urokodaki did not even want to think about the final selection. So many of his disciples have died. They were all good children. A single day with the Kamado siblings proved to him that they were both good children, too. Urokodaki could already feel himself letting them into his heart. Tanjiro and Nezuko cared about each other so much. Urokodaki worried what they would do without each other. It seemed they had clung to each other for comfort in the wake of the tragedy that had ruined their lives, made each other their sole reason for living. It was both commendable and concerning. Hopefully, neither of them would have to deal with losing the other anytime soon. As long as they were under Urokodaki's roof, he swore that he would keep them both protected. Urokodaki had asked Nezuko, as they walked up the mountains, what she was willing to endure for the sake of her brother. Anything, she had replied. Urokodaki had asked Tanjiro, when he had gotten back to his hut, if he could handle Nezuko's suffering. He had reluctantly nodded. Both of them were putting their faith in Urokodaki. He vowed not to fail them. As he watched the siblings sleep, the light from the dimming embers of the hearth reflecting upon their faces, he pat their heads softly. Under the fierce glare of his mask, the old man gently smiled. I accept you as my student, Kamado Nezuko. Tanjiro felt like he was falling, down, 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 into a bottomless pit. His body ached, sore. His stomach rumbled, hungry. He felt like something inside his body was changing, shifting, and he couldn't quite figure out what it was. Regardless, the feeling was unpleasant. He felt weightless and heavy at the same time. His body was aching for something he couldn't quite provide. In response, it was retaliating, fighting against him, keeping him stuck into this strange limbo that he couldn't quite escape from. Nezuko, he thought, desperately. He felt his finger twitch, but that was about it. Everywhere he was surrounded by darkness, and he didn't quite know how he could break free. His eyelids felt as heavy as boulders, and his breathing was frustratingly deep. He knew this feeling, had felt it before. It was the same feeling of being stuck in a sleep paralysis, aware and yet asleep, unable to move your body even though you want to so desperately. It felt like an eternity. He couldn't stay asleep like this. Nezuko was going to start training in the morning. He had to be there to support her. Nezuko, he tried again. For Nezuko. Tanjiro opened his eyes and gasped. He immediately sat up from the futon, clutching at his chest. His heart was pounding. Oni-chan was the first thing he heard as he felt someone jump at him, enveloping him in a tight hug. He recognized her scent before he had properly registered her appearance. Nezuko. This was Nezuko. He reached a hand out to touch her back, patting her softly as she seemed to have burst into tears. From a distance, he could see Urokodaki, still masked, watching them intently from the doorway. That's odd. Tanjiro remembered falling asleep in the main room, right beside Nezuko, but it seemed he was now in the bedroom at the back. After a long minute, Nezuko finally pulled back, her pink eyes still wet as she shouted through her tears, practically lecturing him. Oni-chan, why did you fall asleep all of a sudden? Never waking up once for days and weeks. I was worried, I didn't know what's happening to you. I thought you'd die. Tanjiro stared dumbly at Nezuko, finally taking her in. She had bruises and scratches on her face. The hand that was now cupping Tanjiro's cheeks felt hardened, and he could smell blood from small cuts and blisters that were no doubt there. But what took him off guard the most was Nezuko's hair, once long and reaching down her back, now cut short and barely brushing around her shoulders. He reached a hand out to touch it, letting a lock brush his fingertips. Nezuko's hair. Nezuko's beautiful black hair. The hair their mother loved, the hair she had kept long for years. Tanjiro's brain stuttered. Tanjiro was asleep for nearly a month. It felt unreal. It didn't feel that long. If he hadn't fought and pushed through the paralysis at the time, he would have easily slept for longer. He almost believed that Urokodaki and Nezuko were having him on, but he could see in their faces that they weren't lying. Not much had happened since Tanjiro had fallen asleep, as most of the days were spent training and training and training. It seemed Nezuko and Urokodaki had already built trust and rapport with each other, as well as a workable routine. In the morning, Nezuko would swing a sword 1,000 times as Urokodaki prepared breakfast. She would meditate and practice her breathing around noon, and then she would go up the mountain and run down through the laid traps until midnight. By the time she was back, she was already hungry and injured and exhausted, and would eat a hefty dinner before collapsing into her futon for the night. Tanjiro had not slept since the day he woke up. He tried to hide it, of course, as he did not want Nezuko to worry. Every night he would wait for her to come back, sitting in front of the door and smiling at her whenever she arrived. Every time, Nezuko was so tired that she would pass out first, not noticing that Tanjiro never laid down on the futon beside her. In the morning, he would smile at her as she greeted good morning, but she was off again and was too busy in the day to realize that her brother had not gotten a wink of sleep. Tanjiro knew he was being stupid. He knew that Urokodaki was catching on, too. It's just that Tanjiro was scared. He still remembered the sensation of fighting against that paralyzing sleepiness, remembered the feeling of being trapped in a long, distant dream. He remembered the feeling of his body trying to change, tweaking itself against his will. He still wasn't quite sure what it was changing inside him. It scared him. The next time he fell asleep, he just knew it would not be just for the night. It would be weeks, months, even years. He wasn't even sure if he would ever wake up. Nezuko was worried enough from his month-long coma. He couldn't put her through so much more. So Tanjiro decided not to sleep. He didn't know what effect it would have on his demon body, but if he could survive without eating or drinking for weeks, who says he even needed sleep to begin with? He told himself he didn't need it. Like he didn't need human flesh to survive. He didn't need to sleep. He could function just fine. Not. The effects seemed to be worsening the more he abstained. It started with a lack of focus, followed by a dizziness. His hunger seemed to be getting worse and worse each day, and he didn't know why or how to stop it. He was tired every day, so tired, and it was tempting to close his eyes, just for a little while, just for a moment. His body ached. He had developed the habit of staying in his younger form most of the day. For some reason, he felt better that way. Less tired. Maybe his smaller form was better at conserving energy. That day, Urokodaki had given Nezuko a free day to rest. It was New Year's Eve. Nezuko and Urokodaki were going to have a small hot pot to celebrate. Tanjiro found himself peeking out of the window to stare sleepily at the setting sun. New Year's Eve, huh? He remembered their family, how their father and mother would toast rice crackers for them after every festival. Those were good times. Everyone would have so much fun making loud cracking noises when they eat them. During New Year's Eve in particular, their father would set aside time from sunset until sunrise, dancing the Hinokami Kagura in the snow every year without fail. It was a family tradition that was passed down from father to son, along with the Hanafuda earrings. And Tanjiro could not help but feel sadness at the reminder that had their family not been slaughtered, had he not been turned into a demon, he would have been dancing by now, offering up his prayers to ward off injuries and disasters to the gods. You're thinking about it too, aren't you, Oniai-chan? He was startled when Nezuko sat beside him, so lost in thought that he had not heard her approaching. Our family traditions around the new year. Tanjiro nodded, hearing his earrings tinkle with the movement. He raised his hand to touch them, deep in thought. Truth be told, Tanjiro felt conflicted about the whole tradition. Evidently, the Hinokami had not saved their family from death, nor had it saved him from turning into a demon. But this was a tradition that had been upheld by the Kamado family for generations, started even before he was born. And it almost felt like a betrayal to his father's memory not to continue it as he should. Nezuko was studying his face, no doubt taking in the many different emotions flitting through him. I have a confession to make, she started, before hesitating. She then started to stand up, smiling at him once again. Wait a moment, Oniai-chan. I have to get something. Tanjiro followed her with his eyes as she stood up and went to the back bedroom. He could hear her rummaging through something, piquing his curiosity, and when she came back he couldn't hold back his gasp, as she stood in front of him with the item in her hand, smiling sheepishly at him. I couldn't bring father's ritual staff with us, as it's too big and bulky, she told him. But these ceremonial robes are not, and I thought you might want them someday. Tanjiro stared at the robes, the one his father had worn so many times as he danced and danced and danced, seemingly forever, captivating Tanjiro's young eyes. Although old, it did not look faded or threadbare. He supposed that's because it was only used one night a year. His hand reached out to caress the material, feeling a little bit like he was about to cry. These robes were a memento of their family. He looked up at Nezuko, seeing her smile become a little sad. Would you like to dance? Tanjiro hesitated. Whether you wanted to dance or not does not matter to me. Oniai-chan, I simply want you to be happy. The honesty in her voice was very genuine. Tanjiro stared at the robes again, conflicted. Should he or should he not? In the end, he felt like he should. Now that the ceremonial robes were right in front of him, it felt like a sign. In the end, he nodded. Urokodaki-san, could we borrow one of your wooden swords? Nezuko had asked as soon as the trainer entered his home, coming back from the nearby village to purchase some vegetables and meat for their hot pot tonight. The old man did not reply for a while, seemingly taken off guard. His body turned towards Tanjiro, who was now wearing the ceremonial robes save for the face covering. The demon shifted uneasily, a little self-conscious as he no doubt looked out of place in Urokodaki's humble abode. He tugged at his attire, face flushing as he thought that maybe he should not have let Nezuko convince him into this. What for? Urokodaki asked as he placed the ingredients down by the sink. Oniai-chan is going to dance our family's traditional Kagura, Nezuko explained. Even though our family is not with us anymore, we would still like to offer our prayers to our family's patron god. Urokodaki seemed to think it over before nodding his approval at Nezuko, who beamed as she went to the cabinet to get a wooden sword. The sword was immediately handed over to Tanjiro, who took it gingerly, testing out a few swipes with it before nodding wordlessly. "Do you need anything else?" Urokodaki asked. "No, I know it is sudden, we don't want to intrude," Nezuko said with a small bow, before turning to her brother. "The clearing in front of the house has enough space to move in. Do you think you'd be fine there, Oni-chan?" Tanjiro nodded again. He smiled at Nezuko and then at Urokodaki, bowing a few times at the old man. Urokodaki merely nodded and patted the boy's head. "Go ahead outside." Tanjiro bowed again before he took Nezuko's hand in his, and the two of them walked out of the house and into the moonlight. Nezuko had a huge smile on her face, evidently excited. Tanjiro found himself wishing that he had started to dance earlier, at the very moment the sun had set, as stated in their tradition. As it turned out, it was already quite dark and the moon was already high up in the sky. Nezuko found a log to sit down on as Tanjiro stood in the middle of the clearing, taking the face covering out and lifting it up to his face to hide his face for the rest of the night. He closed his eyes, reliving the moments when his father had taught him the movements, a silent song playing inside his head. It did not quite have a melody, merely a certain feeling, a beat that he was to move his body to. Even through the tiredness seeping through his body from lack of food and sleep, he pushed through. He really wanted to do this. He really wanted to dance. He took a deep breath. "Tanjiro, breathe. Get your breathing under control and become Hinokami." He lifted the sword. No matter how many times she sees it, Nezuko still thought the Hinokami Kagura was beautiful. She remembered the times she and Tanjiro and their mother would stand by the clearing where her father would dance right in the middle of a ring of torches, each move precise and fluid, hypnotic against the cold, white snow. It was always snowing up in their mountain at the time of the new year, and even with their father growing frailer and frailer every year, when he was dancing he seemed like a different man altogether, healthy and active and alert. Privately, Nezuko thought it must have been the Hinokami granting their father strength to dance for so long. It was a childish idea born from a childish mind, but it was an idea that she still subscribed to this day. Tanjiro danced with the same grace their father had. Perhaps if they were lucky, Hinokami would grant Tanjiro the same strength, help him get rid of the demonic transformation as if it was a common illness. Nezuko smiled at the thought. Wouldn't that be nice, if the gods would simply grant Tanjiro his humanity back? Nezuko absent-mindedly pushed a lock of her hair behind her ear, running down its length and curling her fingers around its tips. She had seen the look on Tanjiro's face when he first saw it, the shock and the unease that his expression gave off when he finally woke up. Nezuko wondered if the hair did not suit her, if it made her look less feminine. She didn't care. She had decided to cut off her hair a week into training, after she realized that it was holding her back. It kept getting tangled and escaping her bun, and was overall distracting. It was a shame, truly. Letting her hair grow that long had taken years. Nezuko had liked that length too, but she supposed having shorter hair was better in battle. When Nezuko snipped her hair off, she had sworn to herself that she would not let it get longer for as long as she still needed to fight, as long as Tanjiro was still a demon. It would probably take her years, but she couldn't take too long. She couldn't grow up to be a woman while her older brother remained his young teenage self. She couldn't die of old age and leave him alone. That would just be too unfair for Tanjiro to miss out on a normal life like that. Nezuko would heal him as soon as she could, no matter what. "That is, the Kagura you are talking about?" Urokodaki asked behind her. As usual, she had not heard him approaching. Nezuko turned to smile at her mentor, who approached and sat on the log beside her. He offered her a bowl of the hot pot, and she smiled at him, accepting the food with a murmured thanks. As she dug into the food with her chopsticks, she saw Urokodaki watch Tanjiro's movements carefully, seemingly deep in thought. "Yes, it's the Hinokami Kagura. It has been performed by our family for centuries," she confirmed between bites. "Hinokami," Urokodaki trailed off. "Are your family swordsmen?" Nezuko snorted and let out a small laugh. "No, far from it. We burn coal and sell them. It's a humble profession, but it got us through just fine." Urokodaki fell silent. "Urokodaki-san," Nezuko prompted. "Those movements, that stance, those are definitely sword forms," Urokodaki told her, confusion coloring his tone. "If it has been in your family, performed as a tradition for centuries, then I would wager that at some point your ancestry, there were swordsmen." Nezuko frowned. "Swordsmen? In the Kamado family?" She supposed it's not impossible, but it had to be a very long time ago. Growing up, burning coal and selling them was all that Nezuko and her family had ever known, and the idea that their Kagura was anything other than a ceremonial dance had never crossed her mind. But Urokodaki was a trainer, and before that he was a pillar, one of the most elite members of the Demon Slayer Corps. He was knowledgeable and knew what he was talking about. If he says that they were sword forms, they probably were. I'm surprised that you had so much trouble with the sword when we started our training. If your family had a tradition deeply rooted in one, did you never learn it? The Kagura, Urokodaki asked, glancing at her. Nezuko watched her brother intently. Onii-chan always shares everything he had with us, his younger siblings. Food, toys, clothes. She whispered, trailing off. I'm sure if I asked, he would no doubt teach me how to do it, too. But the Hinokami Kagura and the Hanafuda earrings are his birthright as the eldest son. It was the only thing that was his and his alone. I wanted him to have something that was his, something that he didn't have to share, so I never asked. I see. He did tell me a few things about, though. Nezuko continued, more brightly. You see, the Hinokami Kagura was supposed to be performed continuously from sunset to sunrise. It was a long cyclical dance that will no doubt leave anyone exhausted, but it uses a certain way of breathing that apparently makes it so the dancer would never tire even in the snow. Onii-chan told me whenever he does it, it warms his body up, and he felt like he could dance forever. It was a very interesting quirk of the Hinokami Kagura, one that still amazes Nezuko to this day. It reminds me of the water-breathing technique. I keep it in mind whenever I'm meditating. Unbeknownst to Nezuko, Urokodaki froze. He stared at Tanjirou disbelievingly, a small suspicion nagging at the back of his mind. The irony of the situation, that a demon of all people would know some obscure breathing form. It was not water breathing, he could tell that much, but there had already been so many different iterations of total concentration breathing that he wouldn't be surprised if it's one of the forms that had died down through the centuries, still being passed down like a torch in the Komodo family. Tanjiro and Nezuko probably had some demon slayer heritage that even the two of them were not aware of. It might just be connected to why they lost their family to begin with. Why would Kibutsuji Musen himself suddenly appear at an isolated house up in the mountains, after all? Nezuko continued eating her bowl of stew. Urokodaki worried. Dancing the Hinokami Kagura that night had awoken something in Tanjiro. It turned out that he couldn't keep up with the stamina the breathing technique required, and he had to stop only 2 hours in, instead of before sunrise. He had hoped his new demon body would make it easier on him, but it seemed his lack of food and sleep were taking its toll. It gave him a newfound respect to his father who did it every year like it was nothing. Frail and sickly as he was. It also reminded Tanjiro of his own weakness. After finding out from Nezuko later that night that the Hinokami Kagura was actually a sword form rather than a ceremonial dance, Tanjiro wondered if maybe he too should learn swordsmanship. He remembered how his last fight had gone, how all he could do was draw it out because he couldn't make a decisive, finishing blow. Urokodaki said that the only way to finish a demon off without exposing them to the sun was cutting off their head with a Nichiren blade. He didn't think the Demon Slayer Corps would ever give him one, not really. But it's not like he had anything else to do. With him being stuck inside the house during the day and awake all throughout the night, he had more free time than he knew what to do with. Back home, Tanjiro always had something to do. Wood to chop, siblings to entertain, coal to sell. Now that he had none of that, he was feeling rather bored. He was feeling very tired and lethargic too. But that's par for the course. Perhaps some good exercise could wake him up. He still refused to sleep, still stubbornly digging his heels into the dirt, and denying his body the things it wanted. It was a particularly hard night for him when he decided to just give sword training a go. Sitting down on the floor beside Nezuko's futon, his eyes had felt like there were boulders placed upon them. He was yawning every minute, and he felt like he could sleep sitting up. His whole body was aching, from his muscles to his bones. Not having any of that, Tanjiro stood up and slapped his cheeks a fair bit to wake himself up, before wandering out of the back bedroom and into the main room. Urokodaki would not mind if Tanjiro borrowed a sword, would he? He had heard Urokodaki once threaten Nezuko that if she broke one of his swords, he would break her bones. Urokodaki was actually pretty scary sometimes, but Tanjiro figured he had heard enough of Urokodaki's words about what not to do with a katana that he knew he wouldn't accidentally break one. Besides, he also wanted to know how a real blade would feel in his hand. Tanjiro looked around the main room, saw that Urokodaki was laying down on his own futon with his back to Tanjiro's, seemingly asleep. Tanjiro risked it and swiped a sword out of the cabinet, tiptoeing around the house and opening the door as gently as he could to go outside. The moon was beautiful tonight. Tanjiro spent a few minutes admiring the stars in the sky and breathing in the night air. He wandered around for a while, trying to find a good spot to practice. The sheathed katana on his hand felt solid and heavy, and he took a deep breath before he held the handle and pulled. He was surprised when he saw the blue hue of Urikodaki's Nichiren blade instead of the normal steel gray that Nezuko uses. Crap, he was sure he had taken the normal one. Oh well, it is what it is. He didn't want to go back to the hut and risk waking Urikodaki or Nezuko up. This would have to do. Tanjiro set the empty scabbard down on the ground and held the handle with both of his hands, aiming it in front of him like he had seen Nezuko do countless times. This spot he had found was a little bit up the mountain, but not too far from Urikodaki's hut, a clearing with a grassy ground, surrounded by bamboo. He swung the sword diagonally, aiming it on a clump of bamboo, and the thing was cut cleanly in half like butter. He supposed his enhanced strength meant that he could swing a sword with more force. It felt like a cheat. He suddenly felt bad for Nezuko. He swung the sword at another clump, but then the blade got stuck on one of the stalks, and he had to tug it a couple more to get it out. He stared at the gash it left on the plant. Anyone can swing a sword, he realized. But to be a swordsman, one should learn how to wield a katana with finesse, one that Tanjiro did not possess, and Nezuko was steadily learning. Now on to the Hinokami Kagura being a sword form. He wondered if it was true. The wooden sword did feel appropriate to the movements when he performed the Kagura that day, so he wondered if it would feel even better with the weight of actual steel. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Become Hinokami. The Kagura was made up of 12 segments, seamlessly moving from one form to another before the cycle goes back to the beginning and starts again. The first form, dance. Tanjiro forcefully lifted the blade into a vertical slash. The second form, clear blue sky. He spun his body vertically, his blade moving in a complete 360-degree arc. The third form, raging sun. He lifted the sword and made 2 horizontal slashes. The fourth form, fake rainbow. He twisted his body and turned every which way. The fifth form, fire wheel. You sure look confident for someone who had stolen my sword and sneaked off in the middle of the night. Tanjiro gasped and opened his eyes, not even realizing he had closed them. He turned to the sound of the voice and stared wide-eyed like a deer caught in headlights. There Urikodaki was standing, wearing his usual attire with his red Tengu mask, staring at him accusatively. Or at least that's what Tanjiro thought was the expression under his mask. Tanjiro swallowed hard as he dropped the blade, immediately bowing an apology. His face burned with embarrassment at being caught. He truly did not want to make trouble. He was expecting Urikodaki to. He didn't know, slap him. He did try to slap Nezuko the day they met, so it wasn't so very far-fetched. Tanjiro did not really mind what punishment Urikodaki had in store for him. He knew he had misbehaved. But what he did not expect was the gentle touch of Urikodaki's palm as he patted Tanjiro's hair, running his hand back and forth on his lowered head. Tanjiro lifted his head to stare questioningly at the old man. The old man retreated his hand and placed it on his back with his other hand. If you wanted to learn swordsmanship, you could have just told me, Urikodaki told him. Tanjiro's eyes widened as he used his finger to point at Urikodaki, and then at the sword, and then at himself, bringing up his hands to give emphasis on his claws as if to say, "But I'm a demon." Urikodaki teaches demon slayers. A demon like himself had no place learning the art of demon slaying, even though he did want to learn, if only to protect Nezuko and kill that monster. Urikodaki let out a good, hearty laugh. Tanjiro was caught off guard by the scent of fondness he smelled coming off from the old man. Urikodaki went back to patting Tanjiro's head affectionately, and Tanjiro felt something like happiness rising inside his chest, threatening to burst from inside him. Behind his muzzle, he offered the old man a shy smile. "I know you won't misuse it, Tanjiro," Urikodaki told him. "You are a good, kind boy." Tanjiro's smile became embarrassed. "And it's not like me not teaching you will make any difference. You already have a solid foundation with learning breathing techniques. I am sure it was only a matter of time before you realize, but that Kagura of yours, there is more to it than meets the eye." Tanjiro tilted his head, staring at Urikodaki with a question in his gaze. Urikodaki let out a deep sigh as he looked up, seemingly staring up into the sky. Tanjiro waited for him to continue, as he seemed deep in thought. When he didn't, Tanjiro let out a huff and tugged at Urikodaki's sleeve impatiently. As usual, Urikodaki didn't seem fazed. He merely looked back down and said grimly, "Tanjiro, we need to talk." Tanjiro immediately straightened his back at the tone of his voice. Urikodaki took the katana that was dropped on the floor as well the scabbard, sheathing the sword and placing it on his lap as he sat down on the grassy ground. Tanjiro let out a small hum as he too sat in front of him so they were face to face, with only the moonlight as their source of light to see each other's countenance. "Take off your muzzle," Urikodaki demanded. I know you still find it hard to speak, but I would really like you to try. This is something of utmost importance. Tanjiro hesitated. The muzzle had already become something of a safety object, a security blanket to wrap around himself whenever he felt unease or discomfort. Even though it hindered him from being able to express himself properly, there is also a certain comfort at the idea that it hid his most obvious demon qualities. There's the fangs, of course, but there's also his voice. It was rough and gravelly, and he growled a lot whenever he was frustrated. He didn't like it. Still though, it seemed Urokodaki would not start this talk until Tanjiro did so. With a sigh, he reached over behind his head and tugged at the ribbon holding the muzzle over his mouth, the bamboo falling easily onto his lap as he met the gaze of Urokodaki's mask again. Muzzle, gone, talk, Tanjiro managed to say with a lot of difficulty. I have a theory on why Kibutsuji Musen came after your family. Almost immediately, rage crept up Tanjiro's throat. His hand curled into fists, nails digging into the material of his pants where he had rested his hand. Suddenly, breathing normally was hard, and he was panting, overcome with emotion. Red eyes turned into slits as he stared at Urokodaki with an expression of hatred. But the old man did not look disturbed. He knew very well that that anger was not directed at him. Monster, Tanjiro hissed. Urokodaki nodded and continued. It has always struck me as strange that Kibutsuji Musen himself would attack some random family living in the mountains. Musen had not been seen by any demon slayer, from Mizunoto's to Pillars, for literal centuries. He was good at concealing himself, and had no reason to stop doing so anytime soon. And yet, he gave his time to personally do this one thing. You were there, Tanjiro. I know it is painful, but try to remember. Is there anything he had said or done that came off as strange to you? Anything at all? Trying to remember that horrible, horrible night was easy. Every detail of it was etched inside Tanjiro's mind. He thought of the question for a moment, thinking through the events of that transpired. Yes, there were indeed some strange things that were said, something that Tanjiro had not thought much about before today. A finger idly scratched at the dirt below him as he tried to find the words. Descendant. Musen had said something about his earrings, too. His hand reached up to touch them, playing with them absent-mindedly. Come to think of it, he mentioned the sun several times. Something about breathing sun. Sun, he insisted. Frustration crept up his throat at the inability to properly express himself. Even so, at least Urokodaki seemed to get some of it. Urokodaki let out a sigh. As I thought, he replied. Tanjiro, I think you and Nezuko have demon slaying in your blood. Tanjiro stared back at Urokodaki in confusion. I think you are descendants of a demon slayer, someone that had granted Musen some personal offense, and his assault on your family was not a random attack, but a premeditated one, Urokodaki explained. I think so because that family tradition you had shown me, the Hinokami Kagura, it is very likely a branch of total concentration breathing. The breathing form that demon slayers had used for centuries to defeat your kind. Perhaps Musen turning you into a demon was his idea of a spit in your family's face, a revenge of sorts on your family's honor. Do you understand what I'm saying? Slightly shaken by the revelation, Tanjiro shakily nodded. He remembered the words the monster had said before he gave Tanjiro his blood. A descendant of the sun breathers surely would have a chance to defeat the sun someday. Sun, he croaked again. Sun, Bria, thing, sun breathing, huh? Urokodaki asked. I will try to look into it. When Nezuko wakes up, I will tell her about this as well. But before we conclude our talk, there is something else we must discuss. Tanjiro blinked at the old man questioningly. The old man's voice became stern. Did you think I would not notice, boy, that you have not slept for an entire fortnight? Explain yourself. A fortnight? Has it really been a fortnight already? Tanjiro shuffled in his seat anxiously, claws digging into the material of his pants again. But now for a very different reason. He had known that Urokodaki had probably already noticed, but he had hoped that he wouldn't scold him about it like this. After all, Tanjiro had already slept for a whole month that one time. Was his tiredness and lethargy that obvious? He didn't think Nezuko had noticed. But then again, Tanjiro had spent more time at home with Urokodaki than with his sister these days, because Nezuko was always out training. He chewed at his lower lip, feeling the sharp edge of his fangs brushing along the soft skin of his lip. He didn't know how to explain himself, didn't know how to make Urokodaki understand. Sleeping felt dangerous at this point. Tanjiro didn't know how to explain it. Wake, not, Nezuko. Worry, wake, not, he tried to say, staring down at his lap. Urokodaki let out a hum. I had you checked by a doctor when you first didn't wake up. You know, Urokodaki told him. He told us that all of your vitals were fine, and that there was nothing wrong with you while you were sleeping. The only problem was that you were not waking up, but to be perfectly honest, I think that might be a good thing. Tanjiro looked up at him doubtfully. I'm just guessing here, but it could be that you are recovering your strength by sleeping instead of consuming human flesh, Urokodaki continued. It could be that your body is having trouble trying to acclimate itself into a lifestyle without any food, and it is making you sleep more to compensate. If you continue to reject your body like this, I worry you won't be able to continue to resist your feeding urges soon. Eat or sleep, Tanjiro. Those are your only options. But Tanjiro stared at Urokodaki helplessly. Eat or sleep. He could not allow himself to eat, obviously, but sleeping is out of the question either. If he slept, he didn't know how long he would sleep for, didn't know if he could break through the sleep paralysis a second time. He couldn't worry Nezuko for that long. What if he slept and when he woke up, Nezuko was already an old lady? Demons could live for hundreds of years after all. What if he slept and when he woke up, Nezuko was dead? Dead of old age or dead because Tanjiro wasn't there to protect her? Both options were unbearable. He clenched his fist, conflicted. Eat or sleep, Tanjiro, Urokodaki prompted. Tanjiro shook his head vehemently, refusing to choose. He would figure this out himself. He wouldn't give in to either. Urokodaki waited for him to respond, but he kept his mouth shut rebelliously. In the end, Urokodaki sighed. I was worried this was going to happen, he mumbled. Tanjiro let out a low growl in defiance. There is a third option, but I had hoped we would not need to resort to this. Remember, Tanjiro, that this is your choice. It is your life and your sister's that's going to be affected, and I implore you to think this through seriously. Tanjiro paused. A third option, and then to his surprise, Urokodaki suddenly unsheathed the sword on his lap, aiming the blade at his arm. Tanjiro did not even have a chance to stop him as he moved the katana, slashing a deep cut into his own flesh. Almost immediately, the smell of blood wafted in the air, and Tanjiro's eyes slitted in response, teeth baring unconsciously as he was once again met with the barrage of primal instincts that he wanted no part of. He thought he was managing his hunger well before this point, but at the sight of a bleeding human, it rose like a roaring lion in his gut, screaming and pleading and begging to be given sustenance. The tiredness and lethargy wasn't helping either. With his exhausted physical state, it felt even harder to control his own turbulent emotions. Even so, he endured. He shut his eyes as he dug his claws into his palm. He bit his tongue and tasted his own blood inside his mouth. Even so, Urokodaki did not wrap his injury up. He did not move, simply sitting there and waiting. What was Urokodaki doing? He desperately wondered. Didn't he know that Tanjiro was suffering? Tanjiro opened his eyes to stare back at the old man, actively avoiding looking at the wound in his arm. Not that it helped much. His nose was still picking up the sickly sweet scent. He was going crazy. This is your third option, Tanjiro. Blood. On average, a human can safely donate a pint of blood every 2 months. Between Nezuko and I, we can surely sustain you for as long as the two of you are living here. After that, we will have to see how much blood your body requires so we can plan accordingly. Drinking freely given human blood is a way for you to feed without hurting a single innocent person. It would also surely keep your body from trying to go through such extremes to help you recover your strength. However, this is not without consequence. Every drop of blood you drink will be a challenge to your self-control. Every time you drink, you must force yourself to stop. You must teach yourself to be content with a small amount of blood, and nothing more. Do you think you can handle that? Handle that? Tanjiro could not even handle the sight of it. That blood will touch his lips, his tongue, go down his throat. What was that hell on earth? At the same time though, his body was singing. He was being allowed to have something. He wanted it. He wanted it so bad. His body wanted it so bad. But he held his ground, trying to clear his head as he considered his options. Eat humans, sleep maybe forever, or drink small amounts of human blood. The first one was out of the question. The second and third one both have severe consequences. But above all else, Tanjiro wanted to be there for his sister. He could not stay by her side as a man-eating monster, nor could he do that while he was knocked out and asleep. In the end, it did not matter. There was only one option for Tanjiro. He just needed to pull it off, dig his heels into the dirt with his innate stubbornness and tell his body who's the boss. You will drink blood, and you will not yearn for flesh, he told his body. You will accept what is given to you, and not a drop more. He took a shaky breath and nodded. He could do this. Do your best, Tanjiro, he cheered himself. Under all these demonic instincts, you are human. Urokodaki let out a grunt. He offered his bleeding arm to Tanjiro. If you think you can do it, give it a shot. If you could not, however, Urokodaki's tone became hard, cold even. I will slice your head off right here and now. Nezuko had sworn on your honor, Tanjiro. Remember that. My brother is the gentlest, kindest person in the world, he remembered Nezuko saying. He did not want to betray her trust in his character. Tanjiro reached a hand out to grab Urikodaki's arm, staring at it with determination and resolve. The injury was deep, the blood now dripping down to the ground. He leaned down and with bated breath licked a strip of skin that was covered in the crimson liquid. Almost as soon as he tasted the human blood in his mouth, the instinct to eat increased tenfold. He let out a growl, and it was all he could do not bite down, fingernails digging into Urikodaki's flesh as he struggled to control himself. Endure, 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 he told himself. You are the eldest son, you are human, endure, damn it. His body sang with the taste in his mouth. He had not realized how parched his throat was until warm blood passed through them. He sucked in and gulped. Nothing in the world mattered but him and his food. Still, his body complained. Not enough, not enough, not enough, more. He wanted to bite down and finally eat. Eat, 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 eat. Tanjiro shut his eyes as he slurped and gulped, rejecting the instinct. More. S voice cut through the haze in his head, harsh and decisive. Immediately, Tanjiro opened his shut eyes and tore his mouth away from the injury, letting out a hiss as if he was burned. He held both of his hands close to his chest as if to keep them from reaching out to Urikodaki's arm again, his entire body shaking from head to toe. Was it done? Was it over? The taste of human blood in his mouth still lingered, ambrosia and nectar to his starving demon body. He wanted more, but he didn't give in. You are human, he told himself. A mantra. Nezuko believes in you. And that was when he felt Urikodaki's hand on his head again, warm and comforting. You've done well, my boy. I am proud of you. Tears burned at the back of Tanjiro's eyes, and this time, he did not stop them from flowing and blurring his sight. While his body felt rejuvenated, now humming with new energy, he felt exhausted emotionally. Frustration crept in his throat about why all this was necessary in the first place. Why did Tanjiro have to get turned into a demon? Why did he have to go through so much? Why didn't that monster just let him die? If he had died, he wouldn't have to struggle with this much bullshit. If he had died, Nezuko would not have to suffer every day with training to become a demon slayer. If he had died, Nezuko would be all alone. And suddenly, he was grateful to be alive. A demon, yes, but a demon who will stay by Nezuko's side. He may be a burden, he may feel useless sometimes, but he was still Nezuko's older brother, and he promised his mother's memory that he will do his best. Urikodaki pulled him into a hug as he cried, sobbing silently into the old man's clothes. Thank Yuriko, Sam, thank you. Nezuko was furious with being informed only after everything was all said and done. She was furious at Tanjiro for apparently not sleeping, and then she was furious at Urikodaki for not telling her. She was furious that Urikodaki saw fit to test Tanjiro's self-control like that with the threat of killing him hanging over his head, furious that Tanjiro had been okay with it. She was grumpy and angry all throughout the day, they told her, but Tanjiro wasn't fooled. Nezuko was not really angry at them. Who she was angry at was really herself, for not realizing Tanjiro's predicament, for not being there for him. Tanjiro's heart reached out to her and he gave her a big hug, wanting to tell her that everything was okay. Wanting to tell her that he was fine now, that there was no longer anything to worry about. When Nezuko saw Urikodaki's bandaged arm, she stated that she should have been the one there to offer her blood to Tanjiro. Urikodaki disagreed. According to him, there was no point in the test if it was Nezuko's life on the line. Tanjiro would never hurt her, and Tanjiro knew he was right. In a way, he was glad it was Urikodaki who was there that night and not Nezuko. It only proved to him that as flimsy his self-restraint felt sometimes, he was still in control. Either way, Tanjiro was glad to have chosen the third option. He was already feeling infinitely better. He was no longer tired or lethargic, no longer felt like blinking too long was going to put him in another month-long coma. He felt lively, energized. He had even thrown caution to the wind and attempted to sleep the next day, relieved to find out that he woke up only after a few hours without any trouble. The fear of sleeping through the rest of Nezuko's life was finally removed from his shoulders, and he couldn't be any happier. The only thing left to do was decide on how to go about implementing this new development into their lives, into their routine. One day, a talking crow came to Urikodaki's hut, carrying a package in its claws. Urikodaki took it carefully and told the two kids to sit down as he needed to talk to them both. Nezuko and Tanjiro watched as Urikodaki opened the package and procured a small wooden box, saying that it was something he had requested from a place he called the Butterfly Mansion. Inside was a fairly large syringe made of glass and metal, along with a collection of empty vials and needles. Urokodaki taught both of them how to draw someone's blood, how to screw and sharpen the needles, how to sterilize the syringe and the vials after use, as well as the dangers of messing up. The two of them learned eagerly, promising to keep everything in mind. Urokodaki told Tanjiro that they were going to have to observe him for now, see how much blood he needed to sustain him, how often he needed to feed. This observation period would go on for months. In the meantime, Tanjiro was to keep a journal, writing on it religiously about his hunger, his mood, and his physical condition. Tanjiro didn't mind. He had nothing to do in the day but sleep anyways. Whenever he gets bored, he'd just whip out his journal and write. At night though, Urokodaki had stayed true to his word. He had started training Tanjiro in the way of the sword, teaching him the proper grip, the proper aim, the proper stance. He was a strict teacher, but he was not as brutal to Tanjiro as he was to Nezuko, claiming that what he was giving Tanjiro was not Demon Slayer training, that it was nothing more than an extracurricular activity. He taught him the basics of total concentration breathing, and while he did not teach him the water breathing forms, he did take some time to help him figure out and incorporate the forms of the Hinokami Kagura. Nezuko was thrilled to be learning breathing forms alongside her brother. Dinner times became filled with chatter that, even though Tanjiro could not participate, he immensely enjoyed. Tanjiro couldn't help but feel like Urokodaki's hut had become like a second home. And just like that, the seasons passed. A year into their stay at Mount Sajiri, Tanjiro found Nezuko sitting at the clearing where he first performed the Hinokami Kagura, sitting on the very same log, staring up in the sky, contemplative. Tanjiro had very much expected her to be still up the mountain, running through loads of traps like the usual, so he was surprised to see her there. She had a worried, slightly hopeless look on her face, glaring at the moon as if it had done her a personal offense. Her hands were still clutching the blade she uses for training, the dull steel reflecting the moonlight. Tanjiro sat beside her silently, catching her attention. The demon boy tilted his head at her questioningly, silently asking what she was doing here, why she looked so forlorn. Urokodaki-san told me he had nothing left to teach me anymore, Nezuko confessed. She reached her hand out to take his, basking in the comfort of the shared heat. Tanjiro noted how Nezuko's once soft hand was now rough and filled with calluses, brought upon by an entire year of hard work and harsh treatment. He traced each one with his finger, thinking about the story of each of them, still amazed with how much work Nezuko was willing to do for his sake. Even now, a year later, her resolve remained unshaken. He told me whether or not I can improve to the next level is up to me. And then he showed me this huge boulder and told me, if I could slice through that boulder, he would allow me to enter the final selection. She squeezed his hand. This is it, Onii-chan, the finish line is so close, but is a boulder even something you can slice with a sword? I tried and I don't think I'm doing this right. Tanjiro squeezed her hand back. He gave her an encouraging smile as he gestured at himself. About a month ago, Urokodaki had chosen to stop teaching Tanjiro as well. He had told him pretty much the same thing, that it was up to him now, that there was no more knowledge he could impart, and to this day Tanjiro still wasn't sure what he meant. Tanjiro was a decent swordsman now, but certainly not on par with Urokodaki, or even Jiu. He wasn't sure what he needed to do to continue to improve, either. Nezuko knew this. They were both in the same rut, though the matter was not as dire to him given that he had no final selection to pass and no boulder to slice. It was still the same, in a sense. Nezuko gave Tanjiro a soft smile. I guess this is just one more thing we need to overcome together. An idea sprung to Tanjiro's mind. He immediately stood up, smiled at Nezuko, lifted a finger up as if to say wait a minute, and ran back into the hut. Nezuko let out a small sound of surprise at his sudden action, but Tanjiro paid her no heed. He immediately went inside the house, bowed to Urokodaki in greeting, before taking two of the wooden swords from the cabinet, bowed to Urokodaki again, and hurried back out into the clearing. By the time he arrived back, Nezuko was already standing up and staring at him open-mouthed, asking, Onii-chan. Tanjiro brandished the two wooden swords proudly and tossed one towards Nezuko. He then walked to the middle of the clearing, took a deep breath, and positioned himself in a fighting stance. At first Nezuko seemed confused, but then she started to get it. Her face lit up with delight as she stood in front of Tanjiro with the same stance, face set in a determined expression. The mock battle. Tanjiro and Nezuko had started sparring early on in their training. Sometimes, after Nezuko had gone back from the mountain and Tanjiro had finished his nightly drills, Urokodaki would tell them to grab some wooden swords and fight each other as if it was to the death. He said he always did it whenever he had more than one student around, as fighting with an opponent on the same level could prove fruitful in gaining experience and learning your own bad habits and weaknesses. At first both of them had been very reluctant. They were raised in the type of family that discouraged fighting between siblings, whether verbal or physical. Neither Nezuko nor Tanjiro had a competitive bone in their body, and they both worried they would hurt the other too much. With a little coaxing though, they managed to ease into it, their mock battles becoming more and more intense over time, as each of them wanted to prove to Urokodaki that they had learned something, that they were getting stronger. These days, their sparring has become almost like another bonding activity, something to do when you're wanting to have some fun. There's the added bonus of it being educational. The two of them stood face to face, wooden swords at the ready, watching each other intently as they waited for the other to make the first move. This time, Tanjiro thought he would go on the offensive. That plan was foiled though, when as soon as he braced to attack, Nezuko lunged, bringing down her sword with force onto his face. Tanjiro took a step back, lifting his sword to parry her blow with the handle. He twisted his body to try and make Nezuko lose her balance, but Nezuko dropped to the ground, sweeping her foot down to try and trip him. Tanjiro jumped back, letting out a low growl at the dirty trick, trying to get some distance. But Nezuko was back in his face again, forcefully attacking him with blow after blow, seemingly pouring the frustration she felt over not being able to cut the boulder down onto her older brother. Tanjiro met all her blows, stepping back all the while, until he finally decided he wanted none of it and took a deep breath. Hinekami Kagura, first form, he thought, dodging one of Nezuko's blows and twisting his body to give momentum to a high-powered vertical slash. Dance. For a moment, it seemed like he could smell something, a thread of sorts, lingering in the air. It was connected from his wooden sword to Nezuko's opening, growing taut, but then he blinked and it was gone. To his surprise, Nezuko saw through his attack. She took one step back to avoid the blow, before jumping and twisting her body in a flowing fashion. Tanjiro did not need to hear her whisper to know which form it was. He had sparred with her enough to know. Water breathing. Fourth form, striking tide. She made multiple consecutive slashes at Tanjiro, who avoided it with Hinekami Kagura fourth form, fake rainbow. They parried some more, both starting to get out of breath, but neither folding to the other's will. At one point Tanjiro had started jumping around from tree to tree with his demon body, attacking Nezuko from different angles, which she counteracted by using the swift footwork of water breathing. Ninth form, splashing water flow. She moved around the clearing, avoiding each of his attacks seamlessly, before then using third form, flowing dance to follow him around, moving like waves on the surface of the water, swinging her blade around to hit both his arms and legs, the hits causing him to fall on his back. Had she been using a real blade, he would have been delimbed completely. As it happens, she was not, and he was not human, so her blows would not even bruise. Still, he didn't think it was fair for him to continue without calling it, as it was his little sister's achievement, so he raised his hand in a gesture for, "I yield." Nezuko looked out of breath, but her face lit up in a smile. "I won. I got you, didn't I, Oni-chan?" she said excitedly, reaching down a hand to help him get up. Tanjiro smiled with his eyes and nodded. He was out of breath too, using his sleeve to wipe away some of his sweat. He thought back to the fight, as he always did after one, thinking about what he could have done better, how he could have won. He remembered the scent of the thread, as it was not the first time he had seen it. He wondered what was that all about. Nezuko at least seemed to have cheered up, no longer discouraged now that she had evidence of her improvement. She stared at her hands, clenching them tight as she declared, "I'm gonna train even harder tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. I'll slice that boulder, Oni-chan. One day, I'm sure of it." Tanjiro smiled at her and nodded, patting her head affectionately. She smiled back as they gathered the swords and started walking back home in better spirits. Nezuko chattered about the fight, what she noticed in her own stances, and Tanjiro made grunting noises to point out what he thinks she's done wrong in her footwork or swordplay. It was a one-sided talk, but she did not have much trouble deciphering his grunts and growls, having had a year of experience of dealing with it. Nezuko was so patient in trying to understand Tanjiro, never irritated or annoyed. And Tanjiro had to thank the gods for giving him such an understanding little sister. For a moment, just a single moment, Tanjiro thought he saw someone standing behind one of the trees, but when he turned his head to really look, he was gone. Strange, there weren't any sense of other people around though, so he supposed it must have been his imagination. Still, even as he settled into the night, he couldn't help but think of a boy with peach-colored hair and a scarred fox mask. She was there, among the restless spirits that live in the forests near their beloved mentor's home, sitting down on top of a large boulder that was placed in the middle of the clearing. The final hurdle. The only thing keeping the latest Demon Slayer candidate from participating in the dreaded final selection. The girl was wearing a flowery kimono, her deep cyan eyes staring out into the distance as she hummed, hands absent-mindedly weaving a crown of flowers. In the distance, the shadows shifted, and without missing a beat she smiled at the newcomer, her greatest friend. "How was it, Sabito?" she asked. The masked boy walked closer to the boulder, seemingly deep in thought. "Makomo, I don't think we're going to be needed," Sabito confessed. Makomo's eyes widened, surprised. "Oh, yes," Sabito replied as he took off his mask, looking up with his lavender eyes and giving Makomo a relieved smile. "Tanjirou and Nezuko, I think. They're going to be all right." At that, Makomo smiled, looking up into the sky as she raised the crown of flowers she was weaving onto her head. "Really, that's a relief." She closed her eyes. They were worried for nothing. The shadows of the forest seemed to shift. There were 12 other souls here aside from them, all restless, all waiting for the moment their deaths were given justice. They all loved Yurikodaki very much, that's why they're here. But in the end, all deceased souls must eventually depart. Makomo and Sabito, too. She opened her eyes. "I hope she beats that person, too. And then, everyone will be in peace." Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. And comment down your opinion on this video. Thanks for stopping by and I'll see you in the next one.